The morning Dolores Vega turned 74, nobody brought her flowers. There was no cake on the kitchen table, no phone ringing with voices of people who loved her, no smell of coffee because the old percolator had given out 2 weeks prior and she hadn't replaced it. 74 years old, and she stood at the window of the house she'd lived in for 31 years, watching the garbage truck roll down Oleander Street, and she thought, "This is the last ordinary morning I have left." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She already knew what the letter said. She'd read it so many times the fold lines had gone soft. 90 days had become 60, 60 had become 30, and 30 had become 3. 3 days before she had to be out of the house on Oleander Street, the house she and Ruben had bought when their youngest daughter was still in diapers, the house where every wall held a nail hole from a picture she'd hung and taken down and hung again over the decades. The house where Ruben Vega had taken his last breath on a Tuesday in March, for years prior, in the bedroom at the end of the hall with the curtains she'd sewn herself. The bank wasn't cruel about it. That almost made it worse. The letters had been polite, measured, apologetic in that corporate way that meant nothing at all. The reverse mortgage Ruben had taken out without fully telling her about it had matured. The equity was gone. The house was gone. And Dolores, who had worked 30 years as a seamstress, who had raised 3 children, who had buried a husband, who had never once in her life asked anyone for anything she hadn't earned, was standing at her kitchen window at 74 with nowhere to go. Her daughters had offered, both of them. Patricia and Phoenix, quiet and careful, had said, "Mama, you can have the guest room as long as you need." Sandra and Fresno had said the same thing in a louder voice that meant she hoped the answer was no. Dolores loved her daughters. She understood the mathematics of their lives, the small houses, the husbands who hadn't signed up for a mother-in-law, the children who needed the guest room for visiting friends. She wouldn't go. She'd told them both the same thing. "I'll figure it out." The only thing left that belonged to her outright was the fishing shack, if you could call it that. Ruben had bought it in 1987 for $4,000 from a man named Clyde Harwick who was moving to Oregon and needed the cash quickly. It sat on the edge of Cutter's Lake, 40 minutes north of town, in a part of the county that development had bypassed entirely. 1 room, maybe 300 square feet, walls of rough-cut pine that had gone gray with decades of lake weather. A cast-iron stove, a sleeping loft barely big enough for a double mattress. A dock that listed slightly to one side where Ruben had spent every weekend he could manage, casting lines into the cold, dark water and coming home smelling of pine and fish and the particular peace that water gave him. He'd love that shack more than any place on earth, Dolores thought. More than the house on Oleander, more than the church where they were married, more than the restaurant where he'd proposed over a plate of enchiladas he'd had to borrow money to pay for. She had always found the shack damp and slightly sad. She had gone with him on weekends and read her novels on the dock while he fished, and she had loved him, and she had tolerated the shack as the price of loving him. Now it was all she had. She loaded what she could into the back of her 2004 Corolla, the one with the cracked dashboard and the passenger window that only went down 3/4 of the way. 2 suitcases of clothes. Her sewing machine, a 1971 Singer that had outlasted 2 marriages in the building and would probably outlast her. A box of photographs. Ruben's fishing rods, because she couldn't leave those. A few kitchen things. She left the furniture because none of it would fit in the shack, and she left the curtains she'd sewn because someone else would hang them now, and she didn't want to watch that happen. Patricia drove up from Phoenix on the last day. She stood in the empty living room with her hands clasped and her eyes wet and didn't say anything useful, which was the kindest thing she could have done. They hugged for a long time in the doorway. Then Dolores got in her car and drove north without looking in the rearview mirror. The road to Cutter's Lake wound through pine country, elevation climbing slowly, the air changing quality as the valley fell away behind her. It was early October, and the aspens along the ridgeline had gone gold. Dolores drove with the windows down despite the cold because she needed to breathe something that wasn't grief. She hadn't been to the shack in 4 years. Not since Ruben died. She'd paid a neighbor boy $20 twice a year to go up and check on it. Make sure the roof hadn't failed. Make sure animals hadn't moved in. He'd always reported back the same thing. Still there, still standing, nothing broken. She'd taken that as enough. It wasn't enough. She pulled down the dirt track that led to the lake and parked in the clearing that served as a driveway. She sat for a moment in the car, engine ticking as it cooled, looking at the shack through the windshield. For years of neglect had not been kind. The porch railing had given way on the left side, and the board sagged in the middle where water had pooled and frozen and thawed too many times. The roof had lost a handful of shingles over the door, and there was a dark stain on the pine siding where rainwater had found its way in. The dock was worse, 3 planks missing entirely, the rest gone silver gray and soft-looking. The whole thing seemed to be in the process of quietly returning to the earth, which was what small wooden structures did when nobody was paying attention to them. Dolores got out of the car. The air smelled of pine and cold water and the specific sharpness of mountain autumn. The lake lay beyond the shack, flat and gray under an overcast sky, utterly still. A single loon called from somewhere she couldn't see. She stood there and she thought about Ruben standing in this same clearing, probably 100 times over 30 years, unloading the car with that particular lightness he had out here, the way his shoulders dropped an inch when he arrived at the lake, the way he looked 10 years younger in waders. She thought about him standing on that listing dock in the early morning, casting into the mist. Then she picked up her suitcase and went inside. The interior was dark and cold and smelled of mouse. The stove had gone rusty at the joints. The sleeping loft ladder was missing a rung. The small table where Ruben had cleaned fish and played solitaire had a coating of grime that would need real work. But the walls were solid. The floor, rough planks of old-growth pine worn smooth from decades of boots, held without flexing under her feet. The stove, she thought, could probably be coaxed back to life. She stood in the center of the room and looked around at what 74 years had come to. 300 square feet of weathered pine. A rusted stove. A lopsided dock over a cold lake. And then, because she had not survived this long by standing still in the middle of problems, she put on her coat, found the cleaning supplies she'd packed, and got to work. She was on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor when she noticed it for the first time. A section of boards near the far wall, under what had been Ruben's tackle storage shelf, sounded different when her scrub brush crossed it. Not the solid thunk of the rest of the floor. Hollow, like there was empty space beneath. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. An area maybe 3 feet square. The boards cut slightly shorter than the others and fitted with gaps so narrow you wouldn't see them unless you were right at floor level. She pressed her palm flat against it. Cold air seeped up through the gaps. More cold than the rest of the floor, which itself was cold enough. She thought about it for a moment. Then she went back to scrubbing because she had a floor to finish and daylight was going, and whatever was under those boards had been there long enough that another day wouldn't change it. That night, she slept in the loft in her coat on top of her sleeping bag because she hadn't wanted to dig out the bedding in the dark. She listened to the lake make its small sounds, and she thought about Ruben, not with the gutting grief of the first year, but with the quieter ache that had replaced it. She wondered what he'd make of all this. He'd probably say it was an adventure. He'd always been better at that than she was. In the morning, she made coffee on a camp stove she'd had the foresight to bring, and she sat on the porch steps in the cold with her cup and watched the lake go from gray to silver as the light changed. Her phone had 2 voicemails. Patricia checking in. Sandra, less patiently. And a missed call from a number she didn't recognize, local area code. She called it back. Mrs. Vega? The voice was male, middle-aged, businesslike, but not unfriendly. This is Gerald Stroud. I'm a real estate developer. I've been trying to reach you for a few weeks. I understand you now own the Harwick property on Cutter's Lake? It was my husband's, she said. It's mine now. Of course, of course. Mrs. Vega, I'll be direct with you. We've been acquiring lakefront parcels in the Cutter's Lake area for a planned resort development. Your property is one of the last we need to complete the footprint. I'd like to make you an offer. $22,000. That's well above assessed value for a structure in that condition. $22,000. She'd spent more than that on the medical bills in the last year of Ruben's life. I'll think about it, she said. Of course. But I should mention, Mrs. Vega, time is somewhat of the essence on our end. The other parcels are under contract. If we can't complete the footprint, the development may not proceed, and then frankly the offer disappears. He paused. I don't say that to pressure you, just to be transparent. I appreciate the transparency, she said, in a tone her daughters would have recognized as the one that meant the conversation was over. She hung up and looked out at the lake. The call came again 2 days later. Then a letter in the mailbox at the end of the dirt road. Then Gerald Stroud himself, in a silver SUV, parking in her clearing and walking up to the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and a smile that had been practiced in front of mirrors. He was younger than she'd expected. 40 maybe. Good shoes inappropriate for a dirt road. He looked at the shack with the careful expression of someone trying not to show how little they thought of it. Mrs. Vega. Gerald Stroud. I appreciate you seeing me. I didn't invite you, she said pleasantly. But you're here. He laughed as if she'd been joking. I wanted to make the offer in person. Show you I'm serious. He looked out at the lake. Beautiful setting. Really. But the structure itself. He gestured at the sagging porch, the patchy roof. It needs significant work. Work that's expensive. Our offer accounts for the land value, not the building. Frankly, the building is a liability. My husband built that dock, Dolores said. It's a lovely dock, Stroud said carefully. No, it isn't. It's falling apart. But he built it. She looked at him steadily. What do you want to put here? Condominiums? A boutique resort. High-end. Really harmonious with the natural setting. We'd restore the shoreline. Actually improve the ecosystem, I'll let you know, Dolores said. He left a card and a folder of glossy renderings showing a lake that looked nothing like Cutter's Lake surrounded by buildings that looked nothing like anything that belonged here. She set them on Ruben's old table and didn't look at them again. That afternoon, she went back to the floor. She found a flathead screwdriver in the toolbox Ruben kept under the sink, the same toolbox that had traveled with him to every project and repair for 40 years, the handle worn shiny where his hand had held it. She worked the blade into the gap between boards and pried gently. The cut section of floor lifted in one piece, 3 boards nailed to a crossbeam, designed to come out cleanly. Under it was a wooden box, built into the space between the floor joists, dark with age, maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide. Dolores sat back. Her heart was doing something she didn't have a name for. Not quite fear, not quite excitement, something between them. She lifted the box out. It wasn't heavy. The hasp was a simple hook and eye that had rusted slightly, but opened with pressure. Inside was a layer of oilcloth, folded carefully, and underneath the oilcloth were documents. She sat on the floor of the shack in the thin afternoon light, her arthritic knees not thanking her for it, and she read. The first document was a letter, handwritten on paper that had yellowed but not crumbled, in a script so small and precise it looked typeset. Dated August 3rd, 1931. To whoever finds this, my name is Harlan Cutter. My grandfather built the first cabin on this lake in 1887, and the land has been in our family since. I am writing this because I am an old man, and I have learned that the things you do not write down get lost. I am writing this because what happened here should not be lost. She read slowly, carefully, the way she read everything. Harlan Cutter, she learned, had been a mining man. Not a miner himself, but a financier of mining operations across Montana and Wyoming in the years after the First World War. He described, in the careful prose of an educated man writing for posterity, 3 specific transactions from the years 1924 through 1928. 3 mines, 2 in Montana and 1 across the Idaho border, that had produced not just the silver everyone expected, but something no one had expected at all. She read the word and stopped. She read it again. Platinum. Not traces. Not flecks. Seams. Wide seams of platinum or running through the granite beneath the silver deposits, encountered when the miners went deeper than anyone had gone before. Harlan Cutter wrote about it with a precision that made her think he'd been a careful man, not prone to exaggeration. The essay results from Murchison and Gould, dated the 14th of March, 1926, confirmed what the foreman had suspected. The platinum content of the lower seam at the Blackthorn claim ran to 31 grams per metric ton across a width of 4 feet and a confirmed depth of 60. By conservative estimate, the deposit held in excess of 200,000 troy ounces. She stopped again. She was a seamstress, not a commodities trader, but she knew enough to know that platinum was worth more than gold. Had been, in some years, twice as much. She read on. What Harlan Cutter had done with this knowledge was the part of the story that made her hand tremble slightly on the page. He hadn't publicized it. He hadn't sold the claims at market value, which would have made him wealthy by any measure. He had, quietly and methodically, begun buying out his partners in the 3 mines at prices that reflected the silver value, but not the platinum. because none of them knew about the platinum. He had told no one. He had spent 4 years consolidating ownership, and by 1928 he controlled 3 of the richest undisclosed platinum deposits in the American West. Then the crash had come. The letter described 1929 with the brevity of a man who'd survived it and still didn't like thinking about it. He'd lost the mining operations in the cascade of failures that took everything. Lost the companies, lost the surface rights, lost the equipment. But not the claims themselves. The mineral rights to those 3 deposits he'd held in a separate trust structure that he described in terms she'd need a lawyer to fully parse. A trust that had survived the bankruptcy because it had been structured to. And then he'd hidden the evidence of it. Not because he was dishonest, he wrote carefully. Because he'd understood that in the chaos of the Depression, in the scramble of creditors and lawyers, the trust documents and the assay records and the chain of mineral rights transfers would be vulnerable, would be contested, stolen, or simply destroyed by people who didn't understand what they were looking at or by people who understood perfectly well. So he'd put it all here, in this box, under the floor of this shack, which had been his grandfather's shack, which sat on land so remote and apparently worthless that no creditor had ever thought to look at it twice. I am hiding this, he had written, not because I am a thief, but because I am a careful man. The rights are legitimate. The assay records are genuine. The trust is valid. But I am dying, and I have no heirs who would know what to do with any of this. And I am trusting the lake to keep it safe until someone worthy of the trouble finds it. Dolores sat on that pine floor for a very long time. Outside, the lake made its quiet sounds. A breeze moved through the pines, and the shack settled around her with the small creaks of old wood. She looked into the box again. Under the letter were more documents. A great many more. Folded papers, rolled papers, and envelopes sealed with wax that had gone brittle. She handled them gently, barely skimming them. She was not a lawyer. She was not a geologist. She was a 74-year-old woman who had been evicted from her home 3 days ago with $22,000 standing between her and destitution. She put the documents back in the box. She put the oilcloth over them. She closed the hasp. She set it on the table next to Gerald Stroud's glossy resort renderings, and she looked at both of them for a while. Then she made another cup of coffee on the camp stove and went out to sit on the dock with her feet over the water that was too cold to fish in anymore this season. And she thought about what Ruben would say. He would say, "Lola, you need to talk to somebody who knows things you don't." He had always been practical that way. The problem was that talking to somebody meant trusting somebody. And Dolores had not lived 74 years without learning that trust was a currency that people spent faster than they replaced it. She thought about her daughters. Patricia would fly up from Phoenix and take charge and mean well and make Dolores feel like a child. Sandra would worry about what it meant for the inheritance, which was a thought Dolores found exhausting. She thought about Gerald Stroud and his good shoes and his practiced smile, and she thought, absolutely not. She needed someone who knew about mineral rights and trust law and assay records. Someone who didn't have a stake in what she found. Someone she could pay for their time and their discretion. She went inside and searched on her phone for lawyers in the nearest town, which was Crestfall, 14 miles south. There were 3. She called the one whose website didn't look like it had been made in 1999, a woman named Rebecca Okafor, who described her practice as covering real estate, estate planning, and natural resource law. The office was in a converted Victorian on Crestfall's Main Street, the kind of building that had been a dentist's office and a chiropractor's office and an insurance agent's office over the decades, and now held a desk and a bookshelf, and a woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the expression of someone who'd heard a lot of things and reserved judgment on most of them. Dolores put the box on the desk. Rebecca Okafor read the letter without speaking. Then she read it again. Then she looked up. "Where did you get this?" "Under the floor of my shack." "Your shack?" Rebecca looked at her steadily. "The property you own on Cutter's Lake." "The property I own, yes." Rebecca looked back at the letter. Harlan Cutter. She typed something into her computer. Read. Typed again. "There is a Harlan Cutter listed in county records as the original deed holder for the lakefront parcel that became the Harwick property, which is now yours." She looked up again. "Mrs. Vega, do you know what platinum is currently trading at? I know it's worth something significant. About $900 a troy ounce, give or take. Lately more." Rebecca set down the letter carefully. 200,000 troy ounces at $900. She wrote the number on a notepad and turned it to face Dolores. $180 million. That's if these assay records are legitimate, Rebecca said. And if the mineral rights trust he describes still exists and still has legal standing. Those are two very significant ifs. I understand that. And that's at the 1926 assay estimate. If the deposits are as described, the actual recoverable, or could be more, could be less, could have been disturbed by subsequent mining activity in the area. I don't know. Rebecca sat back. What I do know is that if this is real, Mrs. Vega, you need to not tell anyone about this. Not anyone. Until we understand what we actually have. Dolores thought about Gerald Stroud and his offer of $22,000. Someone has already been calling me to buy the property, she said. Rebecca's expression sharpened. Tell me exactly what he said. She told her. Rebecca listened without interrupting. How long has he been calling? 3 weeks. He came to the property in person twice. Before or after you found the box? Before. I found the box 2 days ago. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. That's probably coincidental. Lakefront development pressure in this county has been building for years. But I want you to stop taking his calls. Don't say no, don't say yes. Just stop responding until we know what we're dealing with. She looked at the box. May I have all of these documents copied? I need to bring in a mineral rights specialist. Someone I trust. And we'll need a geologist eventually, but that's a later problem. How much will this cost me? Dolores asked. Because she had to ask. She had a car and a fishing shack and $400 in her checking account. Rebecca looked at her for a moment. What's your financial situation, honestly? Dolores told her. All of it. The reverse mortgage, the eviction, the $22,000 offer that represented the entire extent of her options. Rebecca was quiet. Then she said, I'll work on contingency. If this is what it appears to be, my fee comes out of the settlement. If it's nothing, you owe me nothing. I don't make that offer often. I'm making it because she looked at the letter again. I want to know if this is real. They shook hands across the box. 3 weeks passed in which Dolores learned patience she thought she'd already mastered. She lived in the shack. She replaced the missing floorboards and fixed the railing and, with the help of a neighbor from the nearest full-time lakeside property 2 miles down the shore, a retired carpenter named Walt Brewer, who'd taken one look at the listing dock and declared it a personal affront, began repairing the dock. She made the stove work again. She bought a second-hand space heater at the Crestfall thrift store and set it in the corner. She lined the drafty windows with weather stripping from the hardware store. She made the shack into something she could live in through a Montana winter, which required more ingenuity than money if you knew what you were doing. And Dolores, who had spent 40 years making do, knew what she was doing. Walt Brewer was 70, widowed, with enormous hands and a habit of appearing with a casserole dish whenever Dolores looked like she'd forgotten to eat, which happened more than she'd have admitted. He asked her once what she was doing at the shack alone this time of year, and she told him she'd come into some complications and was figuring things out, and he nodded as if that were a sufficient answer and never asked again. She appreciated this about him. Rebecca called every few days with updates that were mostly non-updates. The mineral rights specialist was reviewing the trust documents. The assay records had been sent to a geological laboratory at the State University for authentication. The chain of title was being traced through county and state records going back to 1887. What she didn't tell Dolores for the first 2 weeks, and then told her carefully over the phone on a Wednesday afternoon while Dolores stood on the repaired dock watching a pair of geese argue about something, was that the trust appeared to be intact. The Harlan Cutter Mineral Trust, formed in 1924, is on record with the Montana Secretary of State. It was never dissolved. It was never transferred. It went into what amounts to legal dormancy in 1932 and has sat there ever since. Rebecca paused. Mrs. Vega, the trust lists the beneficiary as the lawful owner or owners of the lakefront parcel on Cutter's Lake, Harwick Township, as described in the attached survey. That parcel is your property. You didn't just buy a shack. Clyde Harwick sold your husband the mineral rights he didn't know he had. Dolores sat down on the dock. The geese had sorted out their disagreement, and the lake was very quiet. What does that mean? She asked, though she thought she knew. It means that if the mineral rights are valid and the deposits are recoverable, the trust and its assets belong to you. Another pause. The geological authentication came back this morning. The assay records are genuine. The laboratory cross-referenced the ore samples Harlan Cutter had preserved and cataloged with the deposit signatures in the county's Geological Survey database. The deposits are real, Mrs. Vega. They're still there. They were never fully mined. Dolores looked out at the lake. She thought about Ruben, standing here in the mist with his fishing rod, completely unaware. 30 years he'd come to this lake. 30 years he'd fished above what had been sitting under their feet the whole time. How much, she asked. The preliminary estimate, and I want to be clear, this is preliminary and will change as we do more thorough analysis. Rebecca's voice was careful, controlled, the voice of someone managing herself, is between $280 and $340 million in recoverable ore, depending on platinum markets and extraction costs and a number of other variables. The number floated across the lake, and the geese ignored it, and the pines didn't move. $300 million. $300 million under a fishing shack worth $22,000. Dolores sat on the dock Ruben had built, in the cold October air, and she pressed her hand flat against the weathered planks, and she thought, he used to stand right here. She didn't cry, exactly, but her eyes went wet, and she let them because there was nobody watching, and because the grief and the shock and something that wasn't quite joy but was related to it were all present at the same time. And sometimes the body just had to respond to that without any direction from the mind. After a while she stood up and went inside and called Patricia. I need you to come up here, she said. Not because anything is wrong. Something has happened, and I want to tell you in person. Bring Sandra if you can reach her. Mama, are you okay? I'm fine. I'm more than fine. She looked around the shack, at the repaired floor and the working stove and the camp coffee pot and her sewing machine in the corner, because she'd brought it everywhere for 50 years. I'm figuring something out. The complications, however, had not finished arriving. Gerald Stroud called again the following Monday. Dolores, following Rebecca's instructions, let it go to voicemail. He left a message explaining that the development consortium was moving forward and the offer was being withdrawn at the end of the month. His voice had an edge to it now that hadn't been there before. That afternoon, a truck she didn't recognize parked at the end of her dirt road. Two men she'd never seen sat in it for 40 minutes, watching the shack, and then drove away. She wrote down the license plate number and called Rebecca. Rebecca ran the plate. The truck was registered to a company called Stroud Land Development Holdings, LLC. He's watching the property, Rebecca said. Why would he watch the property if he's just a developer? Because he knows something, Dolores said. Or suspects something. Does anyone else know about what you found? Walt Brewer knows I found some old documents. I didn't tell him what they said. We need to move faster. Rebecca's voice had shifted into a different register, more urgent. I'm going to file the trust activation documents this week. Once we file, it becomes a matter of public record, and we lose the advantage of surprise, but it also means Stroud can't do anything to the property without going through a legal process. Right now you're vulnerable. File them, Dolores said. 2 days after Rebecca filed, Gerald Stroud was at her door again, this time without the practiced smile. He stood on her newly repaired porch, and she stood in the doorway, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had done some quick calculations and hadn't liked the result. You found something, he said. Not a question. People find things all the time, Dolores said. What brings you by, Mr. Stroud? I want to revise my offer. He named a number, $800,000. Dolores said nothing. $1.2 million. He said, faster. Cash. Within 30 days. She studied him. He was sweating despite the cold. A man who had been comfortable and was no longer comfortable, and who was trying to regain comfort at whatever speed seemed necessary. My husband used to say, Dolores told him pleasantly, that when a man who's been offering you $20,000 suddenly offers you $1 million, you should ask yourself how much he knows that you don't. Stroud's jaw tightened. I'm trying to be fair. You were trying to be smart, she said. There's a difference. Good afternoon, Mr. Stroud. She closed the door. She heard his truck on the gravel for a long time after. That evening Walt came by with a pot of soup and found her sitting at the table with the box of documents open in front of her and an expression he apparently read correctly, because he set the soup on the stove and sat down across from her without being asked. You want to tell me? He said. She told him. Walt was quiet for a long time after. He looked at the letter. He looked at the number she'd written on the notepad. He looked out the window at the lake, which had gone pewter in the fading light. Ruben ever know? He asked. No. No one knew. The man who hid this died without telling anyone. Hell of a thing, Walt said. Hell of a thing to sit on a lake for 60 years. 90, she said. He hid it in 1931. Walt shook his head slowly. He was a man who expressed emotion through work rather than words, which was perhaps why he'd become useful to her. He got up and ladled soup into 2 bowls and brought them to the table and sat back down, and they ate together in the quiet shack while the lake made its sounds outside, and he didn't say anything else about it, which was exactly right. The weeks that followed moved in 2 directions at once. In Rebecca's office, things accelerated. The trust activation was filed, and an attorney specializing in mineral rights, a man named Douglas here who had apparently spent 20 years doing nothing else and had an office full of geological maps, was brought into the case. He reviewed the chain of title, the assay records, the trust documents, and the results of the university laboratory's authentication, and he said, in the careful language of a man used to managing expectations, "This is the most significant dormant mineral rights claim I've seen in this state in my career." At the shack, things also accelerated in a less welcome direction. A woman from the county assessor's office appeared, unannounced, to conduct what she called a routine inspection. She walked around the property with a clipboard and took photographs of the shack from multiple angles and asked about recent improvements. Dolores answered calmly and called Rebecca the moment the woman's car was out of the dirt road. Rebecca said she'd look into it. She looked into it. The assessment request had been filed by Gerald Stroud's development company, citing concerns about code compliance on a structure near a protected waterway. It was, Rebecca said, harassment with plausible deniability. But it was also the opening move in what might become a more serious attempt to have the property condemned or cited, which would complicate the title situation. "He's figured out there's something here he doesn't want you to have," Rebecca said. "Or someone told him," Dolores said. "Who?" She thought about it. The only people who knew were Rebecca, Douglas here, the laboratory at the university, and Walt. She trusted Walt with something she couldn't quite articulate, the instinct of a woman who had read people for 74 years and was not often wrong. She did not think it was Walt. But the university. A laboratory meant graduate students, professors, technicians. A finding that's significant in a geological authentication didn't stay contained forever. "It doesn't matter who told him," she said. "What matters is what we do next. We need to establish physical presence on the property more firmly," Rebecca said. "The assessment visit is a warning shot. If he can argue the structure is derelict and abandoned, he has a pathway to complicate your title." "I live there," Dolores said. "Then make it look like you live there. More improvements. Witnesses who can testify to regular habitation." This was not a problem. Dolores had been making the shack livable since she arrived. But she understood what Rebecca meant. They needed a record, a paper trail of occupancy and improvement that was defensible in a legal proceeding, which meant receipts, dates, witnesses. She called Patricia. Her eldest daughter arrived on a Friday with her husband Carlos, who was a contractor, and the 2 of them walked through the shack and the property with professional eyes and made a list. New insulation in the walls. A proper chimney cap on the stove flue. The dock needed more work. The septic system, such as it was, needed inspection and certification. The electrical, which was ancient and minimal, needed updating to code. Carlos could do most of it himself, he said. Patricia looked at her mother across the small space of the shack and said, "Mama, what is going on?" "I'll tell you everything," Dolores said. "Tonight." That night, with the stove putting out good heat and Carlos and Patricia sitting across the table, she told them. She laid out the documents. She walked them through what Rebecca had found, what the geologist had confirmed, what the preliminary estimate said. Patricia was very still for a very long time. Then she said, $300 million. Give or take. Mama. She put her hand over Dolores's. You were living in your car for 45 minutes. I was not living in my car. I was figuring out a next step. Carlos was looking at the letter with the expression of a man running structural calculations in his head, which was apparently the mode he defaulted to under stress. This is Harlan Cutter. The lake is named after his family. His grandfather dug the first well out here, yes. He mentions it. Carlos looked up. My uncle lives 3 miles from here. Old-timer. He's got family stories about the Cutters going back 100 years. He paused. He might know things. She looked at him. What kind of things? I don't know yet. Carlos folded the letter carefully and set it down. Let me call him. Uncle Benicio was 81 years old and had lived at the lake his entire life and had, it turned out, a memory like a hard drive and a willingness to talk about the past that his family had long considered excessive. He came over on Saturday morning and sat in Dolores's repaired porch chair with a cup of coffee and looked at the lake the way people who've known a place their whole lives look at it, with a familiarity that was almost boredom except it wasn't. He listened to the story. He looked at the letter. Harlan Cutter, he said. My grandfather knew Harlan Cutter. Told stories about him. He sipped his coffee. Said he was a man who kept his mouth shut better than anyone he'd ever met. My grandfather thought that was the highest praise. He didn't trust talkers. Did your grandfather know about the mining? Dolores asked. Knew there was mining. Didn't know what kind. Said Harlan had investments he never talked about. Benicio squinted at the lake. There was a story about Harlan hiding something. My grandfather told it like a legend. Said Harlan had buried his fortune when the crash came, that he'd made arrangements so the banks couldn't take it. People thought he meant gold. Assumed it was gold. He paused. My grandfather always said, when they find Harlan's treasure, people are going to be surprised it's not what they thought. The word treasure landed in the quiet morning air. Did he know where? Carlos asked. In the lake, Benicio said. That's what people thought. Assumed it was in the lake itself, dropped off a boat. People tried diving for it in the 50s. He smiled. They were wrong about what they were looking for, and they were wrong about where. Under the floor, Dolores thought. Not the lake. The floor. In plain sight. Under the feet of everyone who'd ever stood in the shack. Under Ruben's feet, casting lines into the lake all those years. Did Harlan have family? She asked. Anyone who might have a claim? Benicio shook his head. Last of his line. Never married. Had a nephew who died in the war. That was it. He looked at her steadily. You found it, didn't you? You found what he hid. Dolores looked at him for a moment. Then she said, My husband bought this property 36 years ago from Clyde Harwick. Benicio nodded slowly. Clyde never knew what he had. He paused. Harlan would have liked that it went to someone who used the place. Someone who loved the lake. He looked at the water. You going to sell? I'm going to do what's right, Dolores said. I don't know exactly what that is yet. She would know soon enough. Because 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning, when Dolores was on the dock drinking her coffee and watching a great blue heron stand in the shallows with the patience of something ancient, a car she didn't recognize pulled down her dirt road. And the woman who got out was not Gerald Stroud, and not a county assessor, and not a lawyer. She was about 60, silver hair cut short, wearing a down vest over a flannel shirt, and she walked to the edge of the property and stopped and looked around with the expression of someone who had been looking for something for a very long time and was not certain she'd found it. Dolores stood up on the dock. Can I help you? The woman looked at her. Her eyes were pale and sharp, and something in them was wound tight, like a spring that had been under pressure for years. My name is Cutter, the woman said. Margaret Cutter. Harlan was my grandmother's brother. The heron lifted from the shallows without a sound, its great wings catching the morning air, and crossed the lake to somewhere else. Dolores watched it go. Then she looked at Margaret Cutter and said, You'd better come in. Margaret Cutter sat in the chair Walt usually occupied and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug Dolores gave her and looked around the shack with the careful attention of someone reading a place the way other people read books. Her gaze moved over the repaired floorboards, the stove, the loft, the small window facing the lake. She didn't speak for a while, which Dolores respected. How did you find me? Dolores asked. The filing. Margaret looked at her. When your attorney filed the trust activation with the Secretary of State, it became public record. My grandmother's family name is on the trust. I have an alert set. She paused. I've had it set for 11 years. Since I started looking. You've been looking for 11 years. For the trust, yes. My grandmother told me about it before she died. She said Harlan hid the mineral rights somewhere safe. Said he told her once that they'd find their way to the right person eventually. Margaret's hands tightened on the mug. She was Harlan's youngest sister. She was 14 when the crash happened, old enough to understand that everything was collapsing, young enough not to fully understand what Harlan had done to try to preserve something. She said he told her, whatever happens, the lake property will hold what matters. She thought he meant something sentimental, a family heirloom. She didn't think about mineral rights. Why did you start looking 11 years ago? Margaret smiled slightly. and there was something self-deprecating in it. My son went into geology. He was doing a survey in this county for a graduate thesis. He showed me the composition records for the Cutter Lake area. Said the subsurface geology was unusual, more interesting than the topography suggested. She paused. He said the platinum signature in the watershed drainage was consistent with a significant deposit somewhere in the catchment zone. He was writing an academic paper. He had no idea what it meant to me personally. I sat at his kitchen table and looked at his maps, and I thought about what my grandmother had said, about the lake holding what mattered. Dolores looked at her steadily. What do you want, Ms. Cutter? The directness didn't seem to surprise her. I want to know what you found, and I want to be honest with you about my position, which I will be even if honesty isn't in my interest. She set down the mug. I consulted a lawyer before coming here. My family connection to Harlan is real, but I have no legal claim. The trust was written to benefit the property owner. You own the property. Harlan chose that structure deliberately. My lawyer was quite clear. I have no standing. Then why come? Because I've been looking for 11 years, and someone found it, and I wanted to understand. She looked out the window at the lake. And because I have information that might be useful to you. About the deposits. About Stroud. That last word landed differently than the rest. You know Gerald Stroud, Dolores said. I know of him. My son researched the Cutter Lake area geology and published a paper 6 years ago in a fairly obscure geological journal. An academic audience, mostly. But last year, that paper was cited in an industry newsletter focused on platinum group metal exploration. Margaret looked at her. Gerald Stroud's company subscribed to that newsletter. I believe he connected the geological data to this specific parcel. That's why he started calling you. He knew, or suspected, before you found anything. The room was quiet. Dolores thought about the truck parked at the end of her road. The county assessor's visit. The offer that had jumped from $22,000 to $1 million in the space of a week. A man who had known, or suspected, what was under her floor and had been trying to buy it for pennies before she figured it out herself. He was trying to take it from me, she said, calmly, as a statement of fact, not an accusation. He was trying to buy it, which is legal. It would only be taking it if he knew and you didn't, and he didn't disclose. Margaret's expression was dry, which, of course, is exactly what he was doing. Does he know I found the documents? He knows you filed the trust activation. Whether he's connected that to a physical find or thinks you found it through records research, I don't know. But he knows you know. She paused. Mrs. Vega, he has significant resources and a significant incentive to complicate your claim before it's fully established. The county assessment visit was only the beginning. I would expect more pressure. Dolores thought about this. Then she said, what information do you have that would be useful to me? You said you had something. Margaret reached into the vest pocket and produced a folded paper. She set it on the table. My son's original geological mapping for this area. Unpublished data, more granular than the paper. It includes depth estimates, composition analysis, recovery projections. If you're going to have a professional assessment done of the deposits, this gives your geologist a significant head start. It also establishes the scientific foundation for the value in a way that's independent of Harlan's 1926 assay records, which will strengthen your legal position considerably. Dolores looked at the paper. Why would you give me this? If I have no obligation to you, and you have no legal claim? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Because my grandmother loved her brother. Because Harlan spent his last years protecting something he believed should survive him. And it did survive him. And you're the reason it survived. You fixed the floor instead of selling the property to the first man who offered. She paused. And because my son will want to write a follow-up paper. Having legitimate access to a significant platinum deposit discovery is worth more to an academic geologist than any percentage of the mineral rights would be. That's honest, Dolores said. I try to be. Dolores picked up the geological mapping. She looked at it without fully reading it, because she lacked the vocabulary to read it properly, but she could see the density of the data, the care her son had put into it. Years of work, sitting in a vest pocket on a Tuesday morning at a Montana fishing shack. She looked up at Margaret Cutter. Are you a believer? The question clearly wasn't what Margaret expected. In a general sense. Why? My husband used to fish in this lake every weekend for 30 years. He stood on that dock, right there. Every morning he could manage it. He died 4 years ago not knowing any of this was here. Dolores looked out the window at the water. He bought this property from a man who didn't know what he had. That man bought it from Harlan Cutter's estate, which sold it because Harlan left no heirs. The chain of it, the way it moved from hand to hand, entirely unknowing, for 90 years, and ended up under my floor. She paused. My husband would have said that's providence. I don't know what I'd call it, but it's something. Margaret looked at the lake for a long moment. Harlan wrote, in a letter my grandmother kept, that he'd put everything he had into a place the lake would guard, that he trusted the lake to know what to do with it. She paused. My grandmother said she thought he was being poetic. She didn't think he meant it literally. He was being practical, Dolores said. He was hiding it under a floor. Yes, but he was also being poetic. Both things can be true. Dolores found that she liked Margaret Cutter more than she'd expected to. Patricia arrived that afternoon, before Margaret left, and there was an awkward 20 minutes of introductions and careful circling while each woman assessed the other. Patricia had her father's directness, which meant she asked Margaret flat questions and listened to the answers with her arms crossed. And gradually the crossed arms came uncrossed as she accepted that Margaret's position was what she claimed it to be. Carlos arrived in the early evening with his uncle Benicio, who came in and sat down and looked at Margaret Cutter and said, "You're Harlan's family," as if he'd known she was coming. "I am," Margaret said. "Your grandmother wrote to my grandfather in 1934, Benicio said. He had the letters until he died. My mother kept them." He looked at her steadily. She asked if anyone had found what Harlan left behind. My grandfather wrote back that he didn't know of anything. She spent the rest of her life wondering, Margaret said quietly. He spent the rest of his life feeling guilty that he couldn't tell her something useful. Benicio shook his head. Almost 100 years of not knowing on both ends. They sat together in the shack that Harlan Cutter had built, and Clyde Harwick had sold, and Ruben Vega had loved, and Dolores Vega had received as her last remaining asset. And they talked until the evening came fully down and the lake went black and the stove filled the room with heat. What nobody said out loud, but what everyone in the room understood, was that something had been waiting here for a very long time. That a man dying alone in the Depression had made a choice to hide something instead of losing it, had chosen trust over despair, and that trust had held. Through 90 years of weather and owners and history that didn't know it existed. Through the war and the boom years and the crash of the 70s and the real estate disasters and all the rest of it. Through Clyde Harwick's 40 years of fishing here without any idea. Through Ruben Vega's 30 years of the same. It had held until a woman with nowhere left to go drove up a dirt road in October with her sewing machine and her late husband's fishing rods and got down on her hands and knees to scrub a floor. Dolores thought about Ruben again. She thought about him often in the evenings, sitting in the chair by the stove that was now a good stove, looking out the window at the lake that had been his place more than any place on earth. She thought about what he would say. He would say, "Lola, you always land on your feet. I don't know how you do it, but you do." He had said that to her many times over 41 years. She had always found it slightly irritating, as if landing on her feet were something magical rather than the result of stubbornness and practical thinking and the refusal to stop moving. But now, sitting in his shack with his fishing rods in the corner and $300 million of platinum under the earth below her feet, she thought maybe he'd known something she hadn't. She thought, "I landed, Ruben. I landed." 3 days later, Rebecca called with the news that Gerald Stroud had filed a formal complaint with the County Planning Board, alleging that the recent improvements to the shack on Cutter's Lake had been done without permits and constituted illegal construction on a protected waterway. The filing cited 7 specific violations, all of them real, all of them minor, all of them the kind of thing that got addressed with retroactive permits in rural Montana counties every day of the week without anyone making a federal case of it. Except that Gerald Stroud intended to make a federal case of it. "He's trying to force a stop work order," Rebecca said. "If the county issues one, you can't do further improvements, which weakens your habitation argument, which potentially strengthens his case that the property is in derelict condition. Can he win? He can cause delays. He can create expense. That's probably the point. To make this complicated enough and expensive enough that you agree to sell." Rebecca paused. "Mrs. Vega, I need to ask you something directly." "Ask. Is there any part of you that wants to sell? At a fair price, I mean. Not $22,000, not $1.2 million. A real number, reflecting the actual asset value?" Dolores looked around the shack. At the singer's sewing machine in the corner. At the repaired floorboards. At the dock that Walt had helped her fix, listing only slightly now rather than catastrophically. No, she said. Then we fight, Rebecca said. And I think we have better ammunition than he does. She was right about the ammunition. Margaret Cutter's son, whose name was James and who had driven up from Missoula when his mother called him, was a geologist with a publication record and professional credentials that made him a credible expert witness. He spent 2 days at the property with equipment Dolores didn't have names for, taking samples, running measurements, cross-referencing his earlier survey data with the new information from Harlan's assay records. He was thorough and quiet, and occasionally stopped to look at the lake with an expression of pure scientific satisfaction that was almost sweet to watch. When he was done, he sat at the table and gave them the new numbers. Not the estimate, the calculation. Based on current survey data, geological modeling, platinum market prices, and projected extraction costs. Rebecca had hired a mining economist to review James Cutter's analysis, and the mining economist had spent a weekend with the data and had come back with a number that required $318 million to be written down and stared at before it became real. $318 million. Under a fishing shack on Cutter's Lake, Montana, that had sold in 1987 for $4,000. Dolores wrote the number on a notepad and set it on the table beside Harlan Cutter's letter. She looked at both of them for a long time. Then she called Rebecca and said, "How do we make sure Stroud can't stop this?" "We go public," Rebecca said. "Carefully, strategically, but we make sure the story exists in the world in a form that's bigger than his legal maneuvering." "You mean the press?" "I mean the press, and the historical record, and the geological community, which James Cutter is already engaged with, and the mining industry, which will have opinions. Once this is a matter of public knowledge, the idea that a county planning board complaint about unpermitted dock repairs can be used to derail it becomes," she paused, "harder to sustain." Dolores thought about it. She thought about the letter Harlan Cutter had written in 1931, in which he'd said, "I am trusting the lake to keep it safe until someone worthy of the trouble finds it." She had found it. She had not sold when the price was insultingly low. She had not sold when the price was suspiciously high. She had found a lawyer she could trust, and a geologist she hadn't expected, and a neighbor with a casserole, and an old man with a century of stories, and a woman who'd been looking for 11 years, and arrived with the scientific data that proved what she already knew. She had, in other words, done exactly what a woman who knew what she was doing always did. She had gathered around herself the people she needed. "Make the call," she said. "Talk to the press." Rebecca made the call. A reporter from the state's largest newspaper arrived at the shack on a Friday, 2 weeks before Christmas, with a photographer and a recorder and the carefully contained excitement of someone who knew they had a significant story. He was young enough that Dolores felt a maternal instinct she tried to suppress. He interviewed her on the dock, which she insisted on because the light on the lake was better in the afternoon and because the dock was the right place for this conversation. She told him most of it, not the exact numbers yet, because Rebecca had advised holding those back until the legal position was fully secured. But enough. The eviction, the shack, the floor, the letter, the trust, the 90-year wait. He asked her, at the end, sitting on the listing dock in the December cold with his recorder on the plank between them, "Mrs. Vega, when you found that box under the floor, what did you think?" She looked out at the lake. A skein of geese was moving south overhead, calling to each other in the cold air. "I thought," she said, "that my husband had been standing on it for 30 years. She paused. "And then I thought, nobody took this from Harlan Cutter. Not the banks and not the crash and not the decades. He hid it carefully enough and trusted wisely enough, and it survived." She watched the geese disappear over the ridge. "And I thought, it came to me, not because I'm special, because I was the one who got down on the floor and scrubbed it." The reporter wrote that down. He wrote it down carefully, which she noticed. When the piece ran 4 days later, the phone did not stop ringing for 2 weeks. Rebecca managed the calls with professional efficiency. The mining industry was interested. The historical preservation community was very interested. James Cutter's geological department at the university issued a statement. The geological journal that had published his original paper requested a follow-up piece. 2 documentary production companies reached out. A museum in Helena asked about Harlan Cutter's letters. Gerald Stroud's planning board complaint was quietly withdrawn. Dolores noticed it in a passing email from Rebecca, buried under more significant news. He hadn't announced it. He'd simply pulled back. The way people with enough resources to cause trouble also had enough resources to make trouble disappear when it became more costly than useful. Patricia came up from Phoenix for Christmas and brought Sandra, who had apparently found her way to something like grace about the whole situation, because she arrived with tamales and a better attitude than expected. Carlos came. Benicio came. Walt came with a ham that was impractical for the size of the shack and entirely welcome. Margaret Cutter came, with James, and sat in the corner by the stove and talked to Benicio about his grandfather's letters and Harlan Cutter's last years, filling in pieces of history that had been separated for nearly a century. They crowded the 300 square feet with people and noise and the smell of food, and the small stove worked hard, and outside the lake lay still under the first proper snowfall of winter, and Dolores stood in the middle of all of it and felt something she'd thought she'd lost when she lost the house on Oleander Street. Home was not, it turned out, a fixed address. It was not the curtains she'd sewn or the nail holes she'd made or the bedroom at the end of the hall. It was this: people gathered, noise and food, and the specific warmth of people who had chosen to be in the same place. She looked at Ruben's fishing rods in the corner, crossed over each other like they always were, and she thought, I know what you'd say. She knew. She'd always known what he'd say. She just needed to hear it in her own voice, finally, after 4 years of silence. You always land on your feet, Lola. I don't know how you do it. Outside, snow fell on Cutter's Lake, quiet and clean, covering the dock and the cleared path and the dirt road and the pines, covering everything, the way snow did, the way time did, not destroying but preserving. Underneath it all, undisturbed and patient, the platinum waited, as it had for 90 years, as it would for a little while longer, until the legal work was finished and the right decisions were made. It had waited this long. It could wait a few more months. And Dolores Vega, who had come here with nothing but a dead man's love and a working-class stubbornness and a scrub brush, was not going anywhere. January at Cutter's Lake was a different country from October. The aspens that had been gold when Dolores arrived were stripped to bare gray sticks. The lake had a skim of ice along the shallows each morning that broke up by noon when the temperature climbed just enough. The pines held their color the way they always did, indifferent to seasons, and the snow that had fallen on Christmas was still on the ground, compacted now into a gray crust that crunched underfoot and let you know exactly where you'd stepped the day before. Dolores had grown up in Phoenix and spent most of her adult life at lower elevations. She had not lived through a Montana winter in 30 years, not since the early years of her marriage when she and Ruben had spent one January in a rented house outside Billings while he worked a construction job and she sewed alterations for a dry cleaning shop. She remembered that winter as the coldest she'd ever experienced and had privately considered it a small miracle that she'd emerged from it still married. This winter was colder. Or maybe she was older and the cold found more of her. But she stayed. She added insulation behind the pine walls as Carlos had shown her, the staple gun working into the evening until her hands ached. She put up heavy curtains over the windows that let in the lake light, but kept out the drafts. She bought a second-hand electric blanket at the Crestfall thrift store and considered it possibly the best $45 she had ever spent. Walt Brewer appeared most mornings with firewood he'd split himself, unstacked it from his truck bed, and stacked it against the side of the shack with the efficiency of a man who found it offensive when wood wasn't properly stored. He never asked to be thanked and seemed vaguely embarrassed when she tried. She had been a seamstress for 30 years. Her hands knew how to work. She took in alterations from a dry cleaner in Crestfall and a bridal shop that had a backlog, and the income was small, but not nothing. Enough to cover groceries and gas and her phone bill and the camp stove fuel she still used in the mornings because she hadn't yet sorted out the propane connection for the proper kitchen stove that Carlos had installed in November. She was not comfortable. She was managing. There was a difference she'd always understood and that her daughters, who lived more comfortable lives, sometimes forgot. Patricia called every Sunday. The calls had changed in character since Christmas. Before, they had been worried calls, Patricia's voice carrying that particular thinness of a daughter containing panic. Now they were different. Patricia had read the newspaper article. She'd spent 2 weeks absorbing the reality of what her mother had found, and she'd come out the other side with something that sounded less like worry and more like cautious wonder. The reporter called me, Patricia said one Sunday in mid-January, for a follow-up piece. What did you tell him? That my mother is the most stubborn person I have ever known, and I mean that entirely as a compliment. Patricia paused. He's writing a longer piece. National publication. He said your quote about scrubbing the floor is going to be the lead. Dolores thought about that. I was just explaining what happened. That's what makes it a good quote, Mama. Sandra called less often, but the calls were warmer than they'd been in years. Sandra had always been the more guarded daughter, the one who processed things internally and emerged with positions that sometimes seemed to have nothing to do with the original conversation. But she'd called on New Year's Eve, which she never did, and they'd talk for an hour about things that had nothing to do with mineral rights or lawyers or platinum, just about Sandra's kids and a neighbor dispute she was having and the casserole recipe she'd been trying to get right for years. Small, ordinary things. Dolores found she had missed them. Rebecca called on a Tuesday morning in the second week of January with the news that the formal negotiation process had begun. She explained it methodically, the way she explained everything. The Mineral Rights Trust, now activated and confirmed as legally valid, gave Dolores ownership of the subsurface platinum deposits across the 3 historic mining claims. To extract the ore, a mining operation would need to be established. That required capital, equipment, expertise, and regulatory approvals that no individual landowner could finance or coordinate independently, which meant the practical path was a royalty agreement with a mining company. They do the extraction, Dolores receives a percentage of the value recovered. Several companies have already approached us, Rebecca said. 3 majors and 1 mid-tier operator based in Bozeman. I've had preliminary conversations with all of them. Who do we trust? That's the right question. The majors have the resources, but the negotiating leverage they'll try to apply is substantial. The mid-tier operator is smaller, more local, and has a better environmental record, but their capacity to move quickly is limited. Rebecca paused. There's also a 4th option. A Canadian outfit, Meridian Platinum, that specifically acquires and develops dormant platinum claims. They've done 6 projects in the Northern Rockies. Their royalty offers tend to be lower, but their timelines are faster. What do you recommend? I recommend we let them compete. We have something they all want and none of them can get anywhere else. The leverage is yours right now. In 6 months, if we haven't settled on a structure, the leverage starts to erode. This kind of discovery attracts attention, and attention attracts complication. Meaning Stroud. Meaning anyone who sees an opportunity. Stroud has pulled back, but he's still watching. I checked his company filings last week. He's raised new investment capital. He's not going away. He's waiting for an opening. Dolores sat with that for a moment. Through the window, the lake was doing what it did on clear January mornings, holding the light very still on its surface, silver and flat, the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself. Then we move before he finds one, she said. That's my advice, yes. We set a timeline. 6 weeks for competing offers. Then we decide. Rebecca's voice carried something that sounded almost like satisfaction. Mrs. Vega, I want to be clear about something. Every major mining company that has contacted us has done preliminary modeling of the deposit. The most conservative estimate among them is $290 million in recoverable ore. The most optimistic is $340. The difference between those numbers, at a standard royalty rate of 12 to 15%, is between $35 and $50 million in your pocket over the life of the extraction. Dolores held the phone and looked at Ruben's fishing rods. $35 million. $50 million. Numbers that had no relationship to any experience she had ever had. Numbers that existed in a register she could not quite make real. She had grown up in a house where her father's paycheck was counted carefully at the kitchen table every Friday. She had worked for 30 years making things with her hands for wages that were fair but never generous. She had raised 3 children in houses where the furnace breaking was a crisis and the car needing new tires was a month of careful eating. She thought. Ruben stood on that dock 30 years, and this was under his feet the whole time. The thought made her laugh, quietly, to herself. Not a sad laugh. Something stranger than that. The absurdity of it. The sheer, staggering absurdity of ordinary life laid over the top of extraordinary circumstance, and neither one knowing the other was there. Set the timeline, she told Rebecca. 6 weeks. If you're hooked on this story, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The competing offers arrived in waves. First, the mid-tier Bozeman operator, a company called Western Ridge Minerals run by a man named Tom Carver, who drove up to the shack himself in a truck that was older than his suit, and sat at the table and laid out his proposal on paper he'd printed himself rather than a presentation deck, which Dolores considered a point in his favor. His royalty offer was 13%. His timeline for first extraction was 18 months. His environmental compliance record, which she'd asked Rebecca to pull independently, was clean. He was honest about his limitations. "We don't have the capital of the majors," he said. "Our first extraction phase would be slower. But we've done this in this geology before. We know how to work carefully in mountain country without destroying it. And the lake," he looked out the window. "The lake stays the lake. That's not negotiable with us. It's how we work." Dolores asked him one question she hadn't asked Rebecca. "Mr. Carver, if you were in my position and someone made you this offer, what would concern you most about it?" He looked at her for a moment. "The pace," he said. "We're slower than the majors. If platinum prices drop significantly during a slow first phase, your early royalties are lower. That's a real risk, and I won't pretend it isn't." She appreciated the honesty enough to keep him in the running. The first of the majors arrived 2 days later with 3 people, a lawyer, a geologist, and someone whose role was never quite clear, but who seemed to be there to make the room feel important. Their offer was 12%, which was lower than Carver's despite their resources, and their presentation included a laminated environmental impact summary that used the word pristine 4 times in reference to Cutter's Lake, which Dolores found both flattering and suspicious. The second major sent only its lawyer with a term sheet and an offer of 11.5%. The lawyer seemed surprised when Dolores read the term sheet herself rather than passing it to Rebecca, and more surprised when she asked a question about the indemnification clause on page 7 that he had to look up the answer to. She thanked him for his time and told him they'd be in touch. Meridian Platinum sent its founder, a 60-year-old Quebecois named Henri Fortier, who had been in platinum mining since before Dolores had known what platinum was. He sat across from her and spoke carefully in accented English and offered 14%, which was the highest offer on the table, and a timeline of 22 months to first extraction, which was the longest. He also brought, without being asked, a summary of the community impact agreements he'd signed with landowners and municipalities in his previous 6 projects in the Rockies. "I have found," he said, "that when a woman owns something of this significance, the question she is usually not asked but most wants answered is, what does this mean for the place itself? For the land? For the water?" He looked at the lake. "So I will tell you what it means with us. The extraction zone is half a mile from the lake at its nearest. We do not blast. We do not use chemical leaching near a watershed. We take the ore out, and we leave the country looking like we were never there, as much as that is possible." Dolores looked at him steadily. "Why is your offer the highest if your timeline is the longest?" "Because I have been in this business 40 years and I know what this deposit is worth. And I know that a woman who did not sell when she was offered $20,000 and did not sell when she was offered $1 million is not going to sell cheap now. I would rather pay her correctly from the beginning than waste both our time." She looked at him for a long time. "Leave the community impact agreements," she said. "I'd like to read them." The 6-week window closed on a Tuesday in late February with 4 offers on Rebecca's desk and one additional complication that nobody had anticipated. Sandra had driven up from Fresno. She arrived on a Saturday without calling first, which was unlike her. Her car was a newer model than Dolores's by a decade and had working windows on both sides. She stood in the clearing looking at the shack with an expression Dolores couldn't read from the doorway, then walked up and came inside and sat down and looked around the room with its repaired floor and its functional stove and its sewing machine in the corner and Ruben's fishing rods and said, "I didn't understand." Dolores put on the kettle. "I thought you were being stubborn," Sandra said, "when you came here instead of coming to us. I thought it was, I don't know, pride that was going to hurt you. I was waiting for you to call me and say you needed help." "I didn't need help," Dolores said. "I needed to figure something out. I know that now." Sandra looked at her hands. She was 51 years old and looked, in that moment, much younger. The way people look when something has cracked open a younger version of themselves and let it back out. Patricia told me what it looked like up here when you arrived. The roof. The floor. No heat. No electricity worth mentioning. She said you fixed it all yourself. Carlos helped with the stove installation. Mama. Sandra's voice was tight, with something she was working to keep contained. You were here alone in the cold, fixing a roof at 74. Parts of it. Walt helped with the upper sections. That's not the point. Sandra pressed her lips together. The point is I should have come. I should have said forget the guest room and Marcos's feelings about it, and come up here and helped you. And I didn't because she stopped. Because you were angry, Dolores said gently. About the house. About what happened with your father's mortgage. Sandra looked up. I was angry at him for doing it without telling you. And I was angry at you for not being angry enough. You were just practical. Just moving on. And it made me feel like I was the only one who cared that we lost the house. The kettle began to whistle. Dolores got up and made 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat back down. I cared, she said. I just couldn't afford to stay in caring. I had 3 days to figure out the next thing. She looked at her youngest daughter. Your father did what he did because he was frightened and he didn't want me to be frightened. It was a mistake and he knew it was a mistake, and I don't know that he ever forgave himself for it. I'm not going to spend what I have left being angry at a man who is already gone. Sandra stared at her coffee. I miss him. I know you do. I miss him and I was angry, and sometimes those 2 things got mixed up with each other. Dolores reached across the table and put her hand over her daughter's. They sat that way for a while. Outside, the lake was very still. Then Sandra said, What are you going to do? With all of it? The money. Dolores had been thinking about this for 2 months. Not in a vague way, but in the specific, methodical way she thought about everything that mattered. She had made lists. She had crossed things out. She had started over. She had talked to Rebecca, and she had talked to Patricia, and she had talked to Walt, who had less to say about money than about most things, but had said the one useful thing, which was, don't let it make you into a different person. You're a good person as you are. She had also read, twice, the complete archive of documents in Harlan Cutter's box. Not just the letter and the essay records and the trust papers, but the smaller documents underneath, the ones she'd barely glanced at on that first afternoon. A survey map of the 3 claim sites. A list of names and amounts that she'd initially taken for business records, but had read more carefully on the second pass and understood for what they were. Harlan Cutter had, in the years before the crash, given money to specific people and institutions. Not large amounts by his standards at the time, but documented. A schoolhouse in a ranching community 20 miles north of Crestfall. A medical fund for miners injured in a collapse at one of the operations he'd financed. A widow's household, listed only by initials, receiving monthly payments that had continued until 1929. He had been a man who thought about what money was for. Not just for accumulating. For using. She told Sandra what she'd decided. She was going to accept one of the royalty offers. She had not chosen which one yet, though she was leaning toward Fortier and his careful timeline and his community impact agreements. She was going to establish a trust of her own, not the mineral rights trust that had been Harlan's, but a new one, in her and Ruben's names together, because Ruben had stood on this dock for 30 years, and she was not going to do this without him. The trust would fund 3 things, to start. The first was the Crestfall County Scholarship Fund, for children in this county going to community college or vocational training. Not 4-year universities only, which was where scholarship money usually went. The trades, the nursing programs, the welding certifications, the practical educations that kept a county like this one functioning and that were expensive enough to be out of reach for the families who needed them most. The second was a medical transport fund for elderly residents in rural parts of the county who couldn't get to doctors 40 and 50 miles away. Dolores had driven those roads. She knew how long they were for someone with no car or a car that wasn't reliable. The third was a small thing, or maybe not a small thing. She was going to buy the building on Oleander Street that had held Ruben's barbershop for 22 years, the one that had been converted to a nail salon after he retired and then stood empty for 3 years and was apparently for sale now, according to Patricia, who kept an eye on things in that neighborhood. She was going to renovate it, put a community sewing room in it. Machines, materials, instruction if people wanted it. Her old trade, made available to people who wanted to learn it. She was going to call it Ruben's, because he would have been embarrassed by that, and she found she no longer minded what he'd have thought about it. Sandra listened to all of this without speaking. When Dolores finished, she looked out the window for a long time at the lake, which was doing its January thing, holding everything in its stillness. Then she said, "Mama, you've had all of this figured out for weeks." "Since December," Dolores confirmed. "You could have told us. I wanted to think it through first without advice." Dolores looked at her. "You both give advice very freely." Sandra laughed despite herself. It was her father's laugh, sudden and genuine, and it made the room feel briefly larger. "Can I help?" Sandra said. "With any of it. The scholarship fund. The setup. I work in finance, Mama. I actually know how to structure this kind of thing." "I know you do," Dolores said. "That's why I was waiting for you to offer." Sandra stared at her. "You were waiting. You're stubborn," Dolores said pleasantly. "You got it from your father. I found it's better to let you arrive at things yourself rather than push." There was a pause, and then Sandra laughed again, and this time it went on long enough that her eyes went wet at the edges, and Dolores handed her a paper napkin from beside the coffee cups, and they sat together at the old table where Ruben had cleaned fish and played solitaire, and the afternoon light moved across the repaired floorboards, and the lake held its silence outside. The formal negotiation with Henri Fortier and Meridian Platinum began in March. Rebecca had taken Dolores's temperature on the choice 3 times before she was convinced it was settled. The 14% royalty was the highest offer. The environmental record was the most credible. The community impact framework was the most specific. And Fortier himself, in Dolores's estimation, was a man who said what he meant and meant approximately what he said, which was the highest standard she applied to anyone she intended to do business with. The negotiation itself took 4 weeks. Not because either side was being difficult, though there were moments, but because royalty agreements for platinum deposits of this scale were complex documents with many pages and many clauses, and Rebecca was not a woman who signed anything she hadn't read 3 times. James Cutter, Margaret's son, participated as the independent geological expert throughout the process. He was 29 years old and had the particular quality of very good scientists, which was that he could hold an enormous amount of technical complexity in his head and then explain any piece of it in ordinary language when asked. He sat through the technical review sessions with Fortier's team and asked questions that made the Meridian geologists pause and look at each other. And after the second session, Fortier had pulled Rebecca aside and said, in his careful English, "Your geologist is very good. Where did you find him?" Rebecca had told him the story about Margaret Cutter and the 11-year search and the academic paper and the geological mapping that had arrived in a vest pocket on a Tuesday morning. Fortier had listened and then looked out the office window for a moment and said, "That is a remarkable chain of events," in a tone that suggested he was a man who believed in things he wouldn't have named in a business meeting. The agreement was signed on the 22nd of March, 4 days before Dolores's 75th birthday. She sat at Rebecca's conference table and read the final document herself, page by page, which took the better part of an hour while Rebecca and Fortier and the assembled lawyers waited. She was aware that this was unconventional. She did not adjust her pace. She read every clause and asked questions about 4 of them and received answers she found satisfactory, and then signed her name in the careful script she'd learned at a Catholic school in Phoenix when she was 7 years old and had never seen any reason to change. 14% royalty on recovered or value. Extraction to begin within 22 months. Environmental compliance monitored by an independent board that included James Cutter. Community impact payments to Crestfall County beginning with first extraction. Estimated total payment to Dolores Vega over the projected life of the deposit, between $41 and $53 million, depending on platinum markets. She set down the pen. Fortier extended his hand across the table. "Mrs. Vega, it has been a pleasure." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when you've done the work carefully." He smiled. "I will." Outside, it was the first day of the year that had felt like something other than winter. The snow was still on the ridgeline, but had pulled back from the lower elevations. The sky was the thin, bright blue that came before real spring. Dolores stood on the sidewalk in front of Rebecca's office building and looked up at it. Patricia was flying in from Phoenix that weekend. Sandra had been up twice since January and was coming again. Walt had a cake planned, apparently, which he had mentioned 3 times without intending to, which meant he'd been planning it for a while. Benicio was coming with his daughter. Margaret Cutter was coming with James, who had taken to driving up from Missoula most weekends and was, Dolores had noticed, increasingly reluctant to leave on Sunday evenings. There was a birthday gathering at the shack. For the first time in she couldn't remember how long, there would be flowers. But before all of that, before the gathering and the cake and the spring light on the lake and the phone calls from grandchildren who had been briefed on what their grandmother had found and were processing it in various stages of astonishment, there was one more thing. Dolores drove north from Crestfall alone. 40 minutes up the mountain road, through the pines that were starting their slow greening at the tips, down the dirt track to the clearing where her 2004 Corolla sat in the same spot it always did now, passenger window still only going down 3/4 of the way. She went inside, made coffee on the camp stove because she still liked it better than the proper one for mornings. Took her cup out to the dock. The ice was gone from the shallows. The lake had reopened, gray-blue and moving slightly in a wind that came down off the ridge, smelling of something green and new. A great blue heron stood in the reeds at the far edge of the water, the same one she thought, or one very like it, still and patient in the way that old creatures that have learned how to wait become still and patient. She sat on the dock with her feet over the edge and her coffee in both hands, and she looked at the water. Below her, half a mile down through the granite and the ancient rock, ran seams of platinum that had been there since before there were people to want them. That had been there when Harlan Cutter's grandfather first broke ground on this shore. That had been there when Harlan himself had hidden the proof of them under a floor and walked away and trusted the lake. That had been there through Clyde Harwick's years and Ruben's years and 4 years of silence after Ruben died, and the long drive up a mountain road with a cracked dashboard and a sewing machine in the back seat. She thought about Ruben the way she'd been thinking about him since October, which was differently than the 4 years before. In the 4 years after he died, she had thought about him with an ache that was physical, located in her chest, something that woke her at 3 in the morning and sat on her like a weight. She had gotten used to that weight, had learned to carry it the way you learn to carry any grief, by incorporating it into the way you moved through the world. But since October, the thinking had changed. She thought about him now with something that felt less like loss and more like conversation, as if the discovery had opened a door between her present and his past, and she could speak to him across it, and he could, in the particular way the dead communicate with the living through memory and through the objects they leave behind, speak back. She thought about him standing on this dock, 30 years of weekends, casting into water that moved above platinum he didn't know was there. She thought about him driving up the mountain road with that lightness she'd always loved, the dropping of his shoulders when the air changed, the way he looked 10 years younger in waders. She thought about him buying this property for $4,000 because Clyde Harwick needed the cash quickly and Ruben had always been good at recognizing what something was actually worth. Had he known? Some part of her wondered. Not about the platinum, not about Harlan Cutter's letter or the trust or any of it. But Ruben had always loved this lake with an intensity that she'd found touching but slightly mysterious, the specific intensity of someone who felt at home in a place for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. Had the lake known something he didn't? Had there been something in the land itself that he responded to, some pull below the surface that he'd called peace and contentment and the best fishing in 3 counties? She didn't know. She wouldn't know. But she liked thinking about it. She liked thinking about him standing here, unknowing, at home, casting his line into the cold water, and the lake holding its secret around him with the patience of very old things that understand that timing is everything. The heron lifted from the reeds without warning, its enormous wings catching the light, and crossed the full width of the lake in a long, slow arc before settling again in the far shallows. Dolores watched it go. She finished her coffee. The wind had picked up slightly, enough to put small ridges on the water, and the light was doing the thing it did on March mornings on mountain lakes, coming in at a low angle and catching each ridge in turn, so the surface seemed to shift and breathe. She needed to go back inside and call Patricia about the weekend arrangements. She needed to call Rebecca about the trust setup, the Ruben and Dolores Vega Family Foundation, which was what they were calling it, because she had decided that her name went on it too. She had put 30 years of wages into raising the family and keeping the house and feeding everyone, and she was going to put her name on this. But she sat for another few minutes first, because there would always be calls to make and arrangements to manage and decisions to work through. There would be journalists and lawyers and mining engineers and her daughters and all the rest of the world pressing its reasonable demands against the edges of her days. There would be Gerald Stroud, probably, somewhere in the background, looking for his next opening and not finding one. But right now there was the lake and the heron and the March light and the coffee going cold in her cup, and Dolores Vega, who had been evicted from her home at 74 with a fishing shack for her last asset, was sitting on the dock where her husband had stood for 30 years, and she was in no hurry at all. The birthday party that Saturday was not, strictly speaking, a party. It was what happened when 8 people gathered in a 300-square-foot shack in March with a cake that Walt had baked himself using a recipe he'd borrowed from his late wife's handwritten index cards, not telling anyone until it was done because he hadn't been certain it would work. It worked. Dark chocolate with a filling that turned out to be cherry preserves, because that was the recipe, and it was the best cake Dolores had eaten in years, which she told Walt. And he looked at the wall for a moment the way he did when he was handling something that got close to feeling. Patricia had brought a photo album. Not a digital thing, but an actual printed album, spiral-bound, that she'd put together over the winter. From old photographs she'd scanned and pictures taken at the shack since October. It started with Ruben and Dolores young, both of them dark-haired and slightly surprised looking in the way people always look in their own young photographs, and moved forward through the decades and ended with a photograph of Dolores on the dock, taken by the newspaper reporter in December, coffee cup in hand, looking out at the lake with an expression Patricia described as complete and total satisfaction. Dolores looked at the photograph for a long time. She didn't quite recognize the expression, not because it wasn't hers, but because it was a version of herself she hadn't seen before. Not performing contentment. Not managing. Actually at rest. She set the album on the table where everyone could look at it and accepted another slice of cake. Sandra presented the preliminary structure for the Vega Family Foundation, printed on 3 pages that she drafted with a lawyer friend and gone over carefully, because Sandra approached every task she undertook with an attention to detail that had always made Dolores proud, even when it was occasionally exhausting. The scholarship fund, the medical transport program, the Oleander Street building, all of it laid out in clean language with projected budgets and timelines. She had added one thing Dolores hadn't asked for. At the bottom of the 3rd page, in a section titled Additional Initiatives, Sandra had written, Cutter's Lake Historical Preservation Project, in partnership with the Montana State Historical Society, to document and honor the life and work of Harlan Cutter, 1871 to 1935, whose foresight and trust made this foundation possible. Dolores read it twice. You don't have to include that, Sandra said. I just thought, no, Dolores said. It stays. Because Harlan Cutter had hidden something under a floor in 1931 and trusted a lake and a stranger and the passage of time, and the least she could do was make sure his name was remembered. Margaret Cutter, sitting in the corner with James, read the page when it was passed around. She was very still for a moment. Then she said, quietly, so that only the people near her heard it, he would have been pleased. Benicio, who was 81 and had known Cutter's Lake his entire life, raised his coffee cup. To Harlan, he said. They raised whatever they were holding. Walt raised his fork. To Harlan, Dolores said. The shack held the sound of it for a moment. 8 voices in 300 square feet, and then the wind came off the lake and moved through the pines, and the old boards creaked in the way they always did, and Patricia was already reaching for another piece of cake, and Emma, Sandra's 16-year-old who had driven up with her mother and spent the first hour of the party trying to look like she was doing something on her phone before giving up and becoming genuinely interested in the story of the box under the floor, asked Margaret if she'd ever met Harlan. He died 36 years before I was born, Margaret said. But you've been looking for his treasure for 11 years, Emma said. I've been looking for evidence of what he did. The treasure was incidental. Emma considered this with the particular seriousness of teenagers who are starting to understand that adults mean things they don't say directly. What did he do? Like, what's the actual thing? Margaret glanced at Dolores. Dolores nodded slightly. He trusted that doing the right thing once, Margaret said. Even in the worst possible circumstances, even when no one would see it, even when there was no guarantee anyone would ever find it. He trusted that was enough, that it would matter eventually. She paused. He put everything he had into a box under a floor, and he trusted that the right person would find it. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and the right person was the person who got on their knees and scrubbed the floor. The room was briefly quiet. Dolores looked at her granddaughter, who was 16 years old and had driven 4 hours in a car with her mother and was sitting in a fishing shack in Montana in March eating chocolate cake, and thought, Ruben would have loved this girl. Yes, she said. That's exactly right. The negotiations with Meridian Platinum had resolved, but the work itself was just beginning. The regulatory approval process for platinum extraction in a Montana watershed district required permits from 4 separate state agencies and a federal review under the Clean Water Act. Fortier's team had experience with this process and moved through it with the careful efficiency of people who'd done it before, but it was not fast. Montana permitting at that scale was measured in seasons, not weeks. Dolores was not impatient. She had waited long enough for this that a few more months made no difference to her. She lived her life at the shack and drove into Crest Fall twice a week for her alterations work and her groceries and her calls with Rebecca, who had become something between a lawyer and a friend in the way that sometimes happened when 2 capable women worked on the same hard problem for long enough. The newspaper story had run nationally by April, picked up by a wire service after the regional piece. The headline had been something she'd had no control over and would not have chosen herself, but the story itself was accurate, and the reporter had used her quote about the floor in the way he'd promised he would. The calls that followed the national story were managed by Rebecca with the same professional efficiency she brought to everything, and most of them were declined on Dolores's behalf, but 2 she agreed to. One was a phone interview with a geological trade publication, because James Cutter asked her to do it, and she trusted his judgment on what would help his work. The other was a 20-minute conversation with a woman in Tennessee who had found her elderly mother being pressured to sell a piece of land that turned out to have natural gas rights, and who had called because she didn't know who else to ask. Dolores talked to her for 45 minutes and gave her Rebecca's contact information and told her 3 things. Do not sign anything. Find a lawyer who works on contingency. And do not be embarrassed about not knowing things you had no reason to know before. The woman cried at some point during the call. Dolores sat with it and didn't rush her. She thought about Harlan Cutter's list of names and amounts. The schoolhouse, the mining widow, the monthly payments that had continued until the crash took everything. A man who had understood, before the word existed in its current form, that wealth without direction was just storage. April turned to May. The permit applications moved through their respective agencies. James Cutter completed the supplemental geological survey that Fortier's team needed for the environmental baseline assessment, and the data confirmed everything the preliminary analysis had shown. The seams were where they were supposed to be. The depth and width were consistent with the assay records from 1926. Nearly 100 years in the ground, and the platinum had not moved. Walt Brewer finished rebuilding the dock properly. Not the patched version they'd done in the fall, with new planks over old joists, but a full rebuild from the posts up. He refused any money for the materials beyond cost and refused any money for the labor at all, which Dolores had anticipated and had prepared for by cooking him dinner twice a week for 2 months, which was a form of payment he accepted without acknowledging it was payment. The dock was solid now, level, built to last another 30 years. She stood on it one morning in May, coffee in hand, bare feet on the new pine planks still pale and smooth, and she thought about what it would look like in 10 years, 20 years, when the wood had weathered to silver and the knots had darkened and the whole thing had the particular worn dignity of things that had been built well and used honestly. She thought about Ruben standing here every weekend morning, casting into the water. She thought, this dock will outlast me. And then, good, because things you built carefully, with attention and intention and the willingness to do the work properly, outlasted you. That was how the dead stayed in the world. Not through money, though money was useful. Through the things they built and the people they taught and the trust they kept and the evidence, carefully preserved, of what they had done and why. Harlan Cutter had been dead for 90 years, and he had built something that outlasted him. Ruben Vega had been dead for 4 years, and he had built a dock that was rebuilt now, but would be rebuilt again, and the lake would still be there, and the dock would be there, and someone would stand on it, eventually, with no idea who had built it first, and they would still feel what Ruben had always said he felt here, the dropping of the shoulders. The ease that came from being in a place the body recognized as right. She finished her coffee. She could hear Walt's truck on the gravel. Patricia's flight was landing in Missoula in the afternoon. Rebecca had a call scheduled for 11 about the permit timeline. Sandra was driving up Friday with Emma, who had apparently decided that Cutter's Lake was now her preferred destination and had told her mother so with a directness that Sandra found both familiar and slightly alarming. There was a lot ahead. There would always be a lot ahead. That was fine. Dolores had never been a woman who wanted the days to be empty. What she had not anticipated, in any of her careful thinking about what came next, was Gerald Stroud. Not his legal maneuvering, which she had anticipated and Rebecca had handled. Not his county complaint, which had collapsed. Not his revised offers, which she had declined. What she had not anticipated was the letter he sent in the second week of May, addressed to her personally, handwritten on plain white stationery in the small, tight script of a man who chose his words with the same calculation he applied to everything. She read it twice, standing at the end of the dirt road where the mailbox was, with the pines making their sound around her and the smell of the lake coming up through the trees. He did not apologize. She hadn't expected him to. What he did instead was something she found more interesting. He explained himself. He wrote that he had known about the geological potential of the Cutter's Lake parcel since the previous year, when a colleague had forwarded James Cutter's paper with a handwritten note in the margin. He had investigated the chain of title, found the Harlan Vega deed, learned about her situation through public records, and made his offer. He had not disclosed what he knew about the potential value of the mineral rights because he was not legally required to, and because he believed she would not have accepted the offer if he had. She stopped at that sentence and read it again. He had been correct, of course. She would not have accepted it. She would never have accepted it. Not because she would have known what the land was worth, but because she would have known something was wrong. 74 years of reading people told you when someone was trying to take something from you even if they couldn't tell you why. He wrote that he had watched, since October, as she found the documents, engaged the lawyers, held off his offers, went public. He wrote that he had started the process expecting to acquire a valuable asset cheaply and had instead watched a woman he'd underestimated outmaneuver him at every turn without appearing to try. The last paragraph said, "I am not writing to make amends. I am writing because I was wrong about what this property was worth to you and wrong about what you would do with it. I thought I was dealing with a situation. I was dealing with a person. There is a difference. I would have done better to understand that earlier." Dolores folded the letter. She stood in the road for a moment. Then she went inside and put the letter in the box with Harlan Cutter's documents, because it was also, in its way, evidence of what this place did to people who encountered it honestly, even the ones who started out dishonestly. She did not write back. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been demonstrated. Walt's truck had pulled up while she was reading. He was already around the side of the shack checking the firewood supply, which had held through winter better than expected. He looked up when she came around the corner. "Good mail?" he said, because he'd seen her reading it, and Walt Brewer was not a man who pretended not to notice things he'd noticed. "Interesting mail," she said. He nodded and went back to the wood, which was his way of saying he didn't need to know more than that, and she found she appreciated it the same way she'd been appreciating things about Walt all winter, slowly and increasingly, and without having looked for it. He had come by every day, or nearly every day, since October. Firewood, repairs, the occasional casserole, the quiet company of someone who did not require conversation but was good at it when conversation was wanted. He was a widower, 7 years out, which was 3 years longer than Dolores had been alone, and he carried his loss the way people who have made some peace with it carry it, present but not consuming, integrated rather than raw. He had not made any declarations or gestures or done anything that could be called forward. He was simply there, consistently and without drama. She thought about this sometimes. She thought about what Ruben would say about it. Ruben had always been direct about things other men considered subtle, and she thought he would probably say, "Lola, there is a perfectly good man bringing you firewood every day and cooking you meals and fixing your dock. Do not make this more complicated than it needs to be." She smiled at the thought of it and went inside to make more coffee, and when Walt came in from checking the wood, he sat at the table across from her, and they drank their coffee and looked at the lake the way they had been doing all winter, comfortable in the silence of it, and she thought, "All right, Ruben. All right." She did not say this aloud. Some conversations did not need to be spoken to be had. The first permit came through from the State Department of Environmental Quality in late May. Rebecca called with the news on a Thursday morning, and Dolores received it with the calm of someone who had been expecting it, but was still grateful when the expected thing arrived. The remaining 3 permits were anticipated to follow within 60 days. Fortier's team was already mobilizing preliminary survey equipment that would need to be in place before the formal extraction planning could begin. James Cutter drove up from Missoula the weekend after the first permit to walk the initial survey transects with Fortier's senior geologist. Dolores went with them, which James had suggested, and Fortier's geologist, a compact woman named Adrienne Bast who had worked platinum deposits in 5 countries, had endorsed. She had said, with a practicality that Dolores appreciated, "You should see it. You own it. You should know what it looks like." They walked out from the shack, following a bearing James had marked on his mapping software, through half a mile of pines and granite outcroppings to the first survey marker. The ground here was different from the lakeshore, rockier, the thin mountain soil giving way quickly to the underlying granite. Adrienne crouched at the base of an exposed rock face and showed Dolores what she was looking at, a faint discoloration in the stone, a slight variation in texture where one type of rock met another. "The contact zone," Adrienne said, "where the platinum-bearing intrusion meets the country rock. This is what Harlan Cutter's miners found in 1924. They went deeper than anyone expected, and they found this." Dolores looked at the rock. It looked like rock, but she understood what she was being told, that somewhere below this ordinary-looking surface, in the darkened pressure of the earth, something extraordinary had been sitting patiently for a very long time. "How do you know it's still there?" she asked. "After 100 years. Adrienne smiled. "Platinum doesn't go anywhere. It's one of the most stable elements in the Earth's crust. It was here when the Rockies were formed. It'll be here when we're finished with it, and long after." She paused. "That's part of what makes it so valuable. It doesn't change. It doesn't oxidize or corrode or decompose. You pull it out of the ground, and it's exactly what it was when it went in." She looked at the rock face. Harlan Cutter knew that. His assay records are meticulous. He knew exactly what he had. Dolores thought about a man in 1931, watching everything he'd built collapse around him in the Depression, and understanding that the one thing he could not lose was the one thing that didn't change. That didn't corrode or collapse or fail. That would be exactly itself whenever someone finally came to find it. She put her hand flat against the rock face. The stone was cold under her palm, cold the way very old things were cold, not the cold of weather but the cold of deep time. "Thank you," she said, quietly, to nobody in particular. Adrienne looked at her and did not ask who she was speaking to, which was considerate. On the walk back through the pines, James fell into step beside her, ahead of Adrienne, who was taking additional measurements. He was 29 years old and had his mother's pale, sharp eyes and his own particular quality of stillness that made him seem older than he was. He had been coming up from Missoula most weekends since March, and the announced reason was always the geological survey work, and the unannounced reason, which Dolores understood perfectly well, was that he was working up to a conversation he hadn't had yet. She let him walk in silence for a while. Then she said, "You should just ask her." James looked at her. "I don't know what you mean." "Margaret," Dolores said. "She misses Crestfall when she goes back to Billings. She talks about this lake the way your grandfather must have talked about it. You should ask her to move closer." James was quiet for a moment. "She'd say she doesn't want to be a burden." "She wouldn't be a burden. She'd be a useful person who knows a lot about this history and has been looking for something to do with that knowledge for 11 years. Dolores looked up at the pines. "James, your mother gave me the geological data that proved everything. In a vest pocket. On a Tuesday morning. She didn't have to do that. She did it because she wanted what was right for this place more than she wanted what was legally hers, which was nothing." She paused. "That's not a woman who is a burden. That's a woman who should be near the lake her family built." James was quiet for the rest of the walk. But the following weekend he drove up with Margaret in his car, not just for the day, but for a long weekend, and Dolores showed her the room in the shack that she'd been calling the spare room, even though it was barely more than the loft and a curtain, and Margaret said she'd think about it, which in Dolores's experience was how capable women said yes when they hadn't finished working through their reasons for it yet. June arrived with real warmth. The snow on the ridgeline retreated to the highest elevations. The lake turned from gray-blue to something warmer, still cold if you put your hand in it, but catching light differently in the afternoon, throwing it back in pieces. Wildflowers appeared in the clearing around the shack, small and specific to this altitude, The kind of flowers that required exactly these conditions and made no concession to anywhere else. Dolores planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the shack, not because she expected much at this elevation, but because she had always planted gardens and she saw no reason to stop. Tomatoes that might or might not produce before the first frost. Beans. Herbs that would certainly do well. Walt built her a raised bed without being asked. Just showed up one Saturday with lumber and soil and built it while she was on a call with Rebecca, and when she came out it was done and he was drinking coffee on the dock. She stood looking at the raised bed for a moment. Then she went and sat next to him. "Thank you," she said. "Tomatoes need good drainage at this elevation," he said, looking at the lake. She looked at the lake too. "Walt," she said, when your wife died, what was the hardest part of the first year?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might not answer, which was his right. Then he said, "The mornings. She made coffee every morning. I'd wake up and the coffee would be there, and then she wasn't there and the coffee was still there, and I didn't know what to do about that." Ruben's was the evenings, Dolores said. "He'd always come find me at the end of the day, wherever I was, just to know where I was." They sat with that for a while. "I'm not going back to town," Dolores said. "I've decided. This is home." Walt turned to look at her. "I know," he said. "You decided that in October." "I know I did. I'm saying it out loud now." He looked at her steadily. He was a careful man and a quiet one, and he understood things without requiring them to be explained to him, which was a quality she had come to value more than she could easily articulate. "Good," he said. They sat on the dock for another hour, until the sun moved behind the ridge and the air turned cool, and then they went inside and Dolores made dinner, and they ate it at Ruben's old table and looked at the lake through the window while the evening settled over everything. And it was, she thought, a very good evening. The permits cleared one by one through the summer. Each one represented months of paperwork and compliance documentation and regulatory review, and each one brought the extraction timeline one step closer to real. Meridian Platinum's preliminary team arrived in July to begin the baseline environmental monitoring that was required before any ground disturbance could occur. They were professional and quiet and treated the property with the care that Fortier had promised, asking permission for each access point and documenting everything with the thoroughness of people who knew they would be held accountable. Dolores watched them work. She found she was interested in the process, not just the outcome. She asked questions and received patient answers, and Adrian Bast, who had become a kind of informal guide through the technical aspects of what was happening, took the time to explain things she hadn't asked but should have asked, which Dolores appreciated. The community was watching too, not in an unfriendly way. Crest Fall was a county seat with 900 people and the kind of institutional memory that small towns accumulate over generations, and the story of Dolores Vega and the fishing shack and Harlan Cutter's buried trust had become part of that memory quickly. People stopped her in the hardware store and the grocery and the parking lot of the pharmacy with the same question in different forms. What's going to happen to the lake? She told them the same thing every time. The lake would be the lake. The extraction zone was half a mile from the shoreline and 100 feet below the water table. The environmental monitoring would continue for the life of the project and 20 years after. She gave them Adrian Bast's name if they wanted technical details, and James Cutter's name if they wanted the geological explanation. Most of them didn't want those things. They wanted to be told by the person who owned it that it would be all right. She told them it would be all right. And she meant it, because she had read every page of the environmental compliance documentation, which had taken 3 evenings, and a legal dictionary borrowed from Rebecca's office. And because she had 40 years' history of 6 prior projects and Adrian Bast's professional reputation and James Cutter's independent monitoring role and her own name on the agreement, and she understood what her name on an agreement meant. It meant she would be watching, and the people who worked with her knew it. The Crest Fall County Scholarship Fund, managed by Sandra through the Vega Family Foundation, awarded its first 12 scholarships in August. Dolores drove into town for the ceremony, which was held in the high school gymnasium and attended by the families of the recipients and approximately half the county, all of whom seemed to feel that attending was a statement of some kind. The mayor spoke. Rebecca spoke. Then Dolores stood at a podium that was slightly too tall for her and spoke for 4 minutes, which was what she'd promised herself and what she delivered. She said, "A man named Harlan Cutter made a choice in 1931 to trust that doing the right thing, even unseen, was worth doing. He put everything he had into a box under a floor, and he trusted the lake. These 12 young people are the reason that trust was worth it. Not because they know his name, though they do now, but because this money, which came from his foresight and his faith and his patience, is going to carry them toward work that matters. That is what he would have wanted it to do. She said, "My husband Ruben Vega stood on a dock above these mineral rights for 30 years without knowing they were there. He fished, and he was happy, and he came home smelling of pine water. He is not here to see this, but this is his too. This is ours, and we are glad to give it." She sat back down. Walt, who had come in from the lake for the occasion and was sitting 2 rows behind her in a clean shirt, gave her a brief nod that she understood meant she had done well. The gymnasium was very quiet for a moment. Then it was very loud. She put the speech in the box with Harlan's documents. Because it was evidence too. Evidence of what had been built, and what it was for, and who it served. She put the cup down on the new pine planks and stood up straight and looked out at the lake. The heron was in the shallows again. Same spot. Same patience. The light was doing what May light did on mountain water, coming in warm and slow and finding everything. Somewhere half a mile below her feet, the platinum waited in the dark of the earth. Patient as the heron. Old as the rock. Waiting for the work to begin. It was, she thought, ready. And so was she. The morning Meridian Platinum's extraction equipment arrived at Cutter's Lake. Dolores woke before dawn. She lay in the loft for a few minutes listening to the stillness, the particular quiet of a late September mountain morning before any wind had come down off the ridge. Then she dressed, made coffee on the camp stove out of habit even though the proper stove worked fine now, and went out to the dock. The lake was black glass. Not a ripple on it. The kind of surface that looked solid enough to walk on until you stepped onto it, and it wasn't. She had been at this lake for exactly 1 year. She had arrived with 2 suitcases and a sewing machine and no plan beyond the next week. And she had stayed through a winter and a spring and a summer, and now the aspens were gold again. The same aspens that had been gold when she drove up the mountain road in October of the year before. The circle of it had not escaped her. The trucks came down the access road at 7:30. 3 of them, large and careful on the gravel, carrying equipment she did not have names for but that James had described in advance so she would recognize the stages of what was happening. The preliminary extraction team was 12 people. Adrian Bast was among them, directing equipment placement with the calm authority of someone who had done this enough times that she had arrived at the other side of competence, where things happened without apparent effort. They did not come near the lake. Their access route went north from the dirt road, through a cut in the pines that had been surveyed and marked and approved by 4 government agencies, to the extraction zone half a mile away. They waved to Dolores as they passed. She raised her coffee cup. Rebecca arrived at 9 with Sandra, who had driven up from Fresno the night before. Patricia's flight had landed in Missoula at 7, and she was somewhere on the highway. Walt was already there, had appeared at 7 with pastries from the Crestfall Bakery and the quiet manner of a man who understood that some mornings required his presence without requiring explanation. Margaret came with James, who would spend the first extraction week on site as the independent environmental monitor. He carried equipment cases and his field notebook and the focused expression of someone walking toward work that mattered. They gathered on the dock, which held all of them now without complaint. 7 people and a year of accumulated trust, standing on pine boards Walt had built over a lake that had kept its secret for 90 years. Nobody made a speech. Dolores had been firm about that. They just stood and listened. And at 9:47 in the morning, from half a mile away through the pines, they heard the equipment start. A low mechanical sound, steady and purposeful, not violent, methodical, the sound of something that had been still for a very long time beginning to move. Dolores held her coffee cup in both hands and looked out at the water. She thought about Harlan Cutter writing his letter in 1931, hiding the box, walking away from this shore for the last time with the knowledge that he was leaving something intact that everything around him was destroying. She thought about the decades that followed, the war, the boom years, the people who had fished this lake and hunted these woods and driven past on the highway without any idea. She thought about Clyde Harwick selling a shack for $4,000 to a man with a fishing rod and a willingness to drive 40 minutes for peace and quiet. She thought about Ruben. Patricia arrived 20 minutes later, slightly windblown from the drive, and came straight to the dock without going inside first, and stood next to her mother, and took her hand and did not say anything, which was exactly right. They stood there together while the machinery worked in the pines. Patient as the lake. Patient as old things that have learned that patience is not weakness, but a form of faith, the belief that what you are waiting for will arrive if you hold still long enough. At 11:15, James's phone rang. He stepped off the dock and answered it, turned slightly away, and they watched his back and the slight changes in his posture as he listened. Then he turned around. His face was the face of a man who has just had a number he already knew confirmed by the one authority that makes a number real. First core samples, he said. Adrienne's team hit the seam at 62 meters. Platinum content matches the assay projection. He paused. It's there. Exactly where it's supposed to be. Exactly what Harlan said it was. The dock was quiet for a moment. Then Sandra, who handled numbers for a living and had been the most measured of all of them throughout the entire year, put her hand over her mouth. Patricia made a sound that was not a word. Walt looked at the lake with an expression Dolores could not fully read but understood. Rebecca said, quietly, Mrs. Vega, you have a confirmed platinum deposit worth $318 million under your fishing shack. Dolores looked out at the water. The lake sat there as it always had, flat and gray-blue and absolutely indifferent to the significance of the morning, which was one of the things she loved about it. Ruben would have kept fishing, she said. There was a beat of silence. Then Walt laughed, and it was the right laugh for the moment, genuine and sudden and brief, and it broke whatever had been building in all of them into something they could breathe inside of. Patricia hugged her. Sandra hugged her. James shook her hand with both of his. Margaret, standing at the end of the dock, nodded once with the specific satisfaction of someone whose 11 years had just been validated, not by money but by the confirmation that her family's history had been exactly what she'd always believed it was. Rebecca made calls. Fortier needed to be notified. The state agencies needed to be notified. The press would need to be managed because the story was already in the world and the confirmation of the deposit would accelerate attention. Dolores let her handle it. She sat down on the dock and let the morning continue around her. The full geological confirmation report took 3 weeks. The confirmed figure, when James presented it in Rebecca's conference room in October, was $318 million in recoverable platinum or at current market prices. Not the estimate. The confirmation. The number that carried the weight of professional certification and independent verification and 4 government agencies that had reviewed the geological data and found nothing to dispute. Rebecca placed the report on the table and looked at Dolores. This is real, she said. It was the most informal thing Dolores had ever heard her say. I know, Dolores said. The national story ran that week. Features in 3 major publications. A segment on a morning news program that used her quote from the original newspaper piece, the one about scrubbing the floor. 2 book agents called. A documentary production company called again with a more serious offer. What she did not decline was a call from a woman named Vera Alonso, 71 years old, who had read the story in a newspaper in New Mexico. Vera had a piece of land in northern New Mexico that her late husband's family had owned for 4 generations. A mining company had been pressuring her to sell for 2 years. She didn't know what the land was worth. She was afraid. Dolores talked to her for an hour. She gave her Rebecca's name. She told her 3 things. Do not sign anything. Find a lawyer who will work on contingency. And do not be ashamed of not knowing things you had no reason to know before. She told her that the people who pressure you to sell quickly are always the ones who know something you don't. She told her that being old and being a woman and being alone did not mean being without leverage, and that leverage was just another word for something people want that only you have. Vera called back 3 weeks later to say she'd found a lawyer. Dolores told her good and hung up and went back to the kitchen garden, where the tomatoes had, against all reasonable expectation, produced fruit before the first frost. 2 days after the national story ran, Gerald Stroud appeared at the end of the dirt road. Not in his silver SUV this time. In a regular sedan, older, the kind of car that didn't announce anything. He stood at the property line and did not come onto the land, which she noticed, and which meant something. She walked out to meet him. He looked different from the man who had stood on her porch offering $1 million with a tight jaw and a rehearsed manner. He looked like a man who had spent several months thinking about something he hadn't expected to spend time thinking about. She recognized the expression because she'd seen it on Sandra in January. particular look of a person who has arrived at an honest position by a long route. I wanted to say something in person, he said. Not by letter. All right. I knew what the mineral rights were potentially worth before I made my first offer. I made the offer I made because I believed you didn't know, and I believed you wouldn't find out before I had the deed. He held her gaze. That was deliberate. I want to be direct about what it was. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because the letter I sent wasn't honest enough. I said I'd underestimated you. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He paused. The whole truth is that I tried to take something from you, and I failed. And I've spent 6 months thinking about the fact that if I had succeeded, none of what you've done with it would exist. The scholarships, the sewing room, the woman in New Mexico you helped. He looked down the road and then back at her. I don't know what to do with that. Dolores was quiet for a moment. She was 75 years old and had been wronged by people before, by larger wrongs than this one, and she had learned that what you did with a wrong depended on what the person who'd done it brought you afterward. Some brought nothing. Some brought excuses dressed as explanations. Gerald Stroud had brought her an honest accounting of what he had done and no request for anything in return, which was the rarest kind. The scholarship fund needs a board member with development experience, she said. Someone who understands land value and mineral rights and the ways people undervalue rural property. Sandra manages the finances, but she's in Fresno. She paused. It wouldn't be charity work. It would be actual work. The kind where you catch the Gerald Strouds before they get to the Dolores Vegas. He stared at her. If you're serious about not knowing what to do with it, she said, that's one option. He was quiet for a long time. The pines made their sound around them, and the lake was somewhere beyond the tree line, invisible from the road, but present the way the lake was always present. I'll think about it, he said. She nodded. That's all I'm asking. He drove away. She watched the sedan go down the dirt road and turn onto the county highway and disappear. She did not know if he would call. She thought he might. People who came in person with honest accountings tended to follow through. She went back to the kitchen garden and checked on the tomatoes. In November, Dolores drove to the city. The building on Oleander Street was a one-story brick structure with 3 front windows and a glass door that still held the ghost of Ruben's old lettering. The barber shop sign removed, but its outline readable in the faded paint. R. Vega, St. 1971. She stood inside it for a long time. She walked the length of it, heel to toe, counting steps. She looked at the pressed tin ceiling that Ruben had always pointed out to customers that ceiling is original. He'd say, 1924, they don't make them like that anymore. She ran her palm along the front windowsill where the afternoon light came in best. The same light that had fallen across Ruben's barber chair for 22 years. She had the renovation plans in her bag. 6 sewing stations. A cutting table down the center. A storage wall for fabric and materials. A classroom area in the back for instruction. The sign above the door would say, Ruben's. Just that. His name. She stood in the middle of the empty building and looked up at the pressed tin ceiling, and she talked to him. Not out loud. The way you talk to someone you have been talking to for 41 years and have not stopped talking to because the talking was never really about the words. She told him what she'd found. The lake and the box and Harlan Cutter's letter and the platinum under the floor he'd stood on for 30 years. She told him about Rebecca and Walt and James and Margaret and Patricia's arms finally uncrossing and Sandra driving up in the dark. She told him about the 12 scholarship kids in the gymnasium. She told him she was going to put his name on a building and fill it with sewing machines and teach people things with her hands the way her hands had always known how to do things, and that this was the part that felt most like herself, most like the 74 years before the lake, because she had never been a woman of large gestures. She was a woman who knew how to make something out of what was in front of her. She told him, I landed, Ruben. Like you always said. The November light through the 3 front windows was the particular gold of that season, low and warm and brief. It caught the pressed tin ceiling and threw small bright shapes across the floor. She went outside and called the contractor. Start Monday. The opening was in January, exactly 15 months after Dolores had arrived at the shack with her last $400 and a cracked dashboard. She had not planned a ceremony, but the neighborhood had other ideas. When she arrived at 9 in the morning to unlock the door, 60 people were on the sidewalk. Patricia, Sandra, Walt, who had driven down from the lake in his clean shirt, Rebecca, alterations clients from Crestfall who had made the drive, and an 83-year-old woman who had been getting her husband's hair cut at our Vega estate 1971 for 15 years and who had called Patricia to say she was coming and did not accept being told it wasn't necessary. Dolores looked at all of them. She thought, Ruben would have been embarrassed by this and would have loved every second of it. She said, he was a man who believed that any place people were made to feel welcome was a good place. I'm hoping to make this a good place. Come in. She opened the door. The sewing machines were in rows, bright and ready. The cutting table ran down the center. The back wall held fabric in colors she had chosen because Ruben had always said the barber shop should feel warm. That warmth was the whole point of a place people came to regularly. She had left the pressed tin ceiling, of course. The 83-year-old woman touched one of the machines and looked at Dolores with wet eyes and said, he would have liked this. I know, Dolores said. She had planned to say more. She had even written 2 paragraphs on an index card in her coat pocket. But standing in the room that smelled of new paint and fabric and the particular old brick of Ruben's building, she found the index card unnecessary. She said, a man I never met hid something under a floor in 1931 because he believed that trust was stronger than catastrophe. He was right. And because he was right, I was able to do this. To put Ruben's name on a building. To give 12 kids a scholarship. To tell a woman in New Mexico not to sign anything yet. To fix a dock on a lake that my husband loved. None of it was inevitable, she said. None of it happened on its own. Harlan Cutter made a choice. Ruben made a choice to buy a shack from a man who needed cash quickly. I made a choice to get on my knees and scrub a floor instead of taking $22,000 and leaving. Every one of those choices had to happen for this one to be possible. What I want this room to be, she said, is a place where people make choices. Where they decide to learn something they didn't know before. Where they make something with their hands. Where they come in uncertain and leave with a skill that nobody can ever take from them. She stopped. She had said enough. Walt started clapping, and everyone followed, and the sound in that small bright room was the best sound Dolores had heard in a long time. Spring came back to Cutter's Lake the way it had the year before. The snow pulled back from the lower elevations. The lake turned from gray to something warmer. The wildflowers came back in the clearing. Dolores planted the kitchen garden again, more confident now about what would grow. The extraction operation was in its second phase. The first royalty payment had arrived in February, a number that Dolores had looked at on her screen for a long time before calling Sandra, who had looked at it for an equally long time before saying, Mama, this is real. She knew. She had known since October, standing on the dock listening to the machinery start. But real had layers, and the financial layer had its own texture that took time to accept. Benicio called one afternoon from his house 2 miles down the shore. He said, my granddaughter got one of those scholarships. She's going to the nursing program in Crest Fall. She wanted me to tell you. Dolores sat with that for a moment. Tell her I'm glad. She knows Harlan's story. I told her. She said she's going to tell her kids about him when she has kids. After they hung up, Dolores sat at the table for a while. The lake was doing its afternoon thing, light on water. The specific quality of spring light that was more tentative than summer, as if it was still remembering how to be warm. She thought about Harlan Cutter's list of names and amounts in the box. The schoolhouse. The mining widow. The monthly payments that had stopped in 1929 when everything stopped. She thought about him writing his letter in 1931, putting it in the box, lowering the box into the space beneath the floor with hands that must have been steadier than they had any reason to be. He didn't know. He didn't know if anyone would ever find it. He didn't know if the trust would hold or the documents would survive or if the right person would be the one on their knees with the scrub brush. He acted on faith that it would matter, and he walked away, and he was right, and he never knew he was right. That seemed to her the most important part of the story. Not the platinum, and not the $318 million, and not the scholarships, or the sewing room, or any of the rest of it. The fact that he did it without knowing. That he chose to trust, in the worst possible year, without any guarantee the trust would be honored. She put her coat on and went out to the dock. But before she reached it, she stopped and went back inside and picked up her keys. There was one thing she had not done yet. One errand she had been postponing since October, not because she didn't know what she wanted to do, but because she had wanted to wait until the right time. She had learned over 75 years that the right time for certain things arrived in its own way and could not be scheduled. She thought this might be it. She drove south. Not into Crest Fall, but past it, further down the valley to the town where she had spent 31 years on Oleander Street. 40 minutes in the wrong direction, away from the lake. She drove with the windows down because the May air was the best air of the year, warm enough, and still carrying something green and new in it. The cemetery was on the eastern edge of town, behind the church where she and Ruben had gone for 30 years and where his funeral mass had been. She parked and walked the path she knew without thinking, between the rows of headstones with their cut flowers and their small American flags and their smooth granite faces. Ruben's stone was simple. She had chosen it herself, the way she chose everything, by looking at a number of options and knowing immediately which one was right. His name, the dates, and below that, in letters she had specified to the stonecutter. He was here. He was glad of it. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she sat down on the grass next to it, which she had done before, on the anniversary, and on his birthday, and on the Tuesday in March that was the day he died, and she talked to him. She told him the deposit was confirmed. $318 million. She said the number out loud because it still seemed to require saying out loud to be real. She told him that the first royalty payment had come and that Sandra had cried a little on the phone when she saw it, and that Patricia had said nothing for 30 seconds before saying that's a lot of money, Mama, which was the most understated thing Patricia had ever said in her life. She told him about the Oleander Street building and the pressed tin ceiling that was still original, 1924, and that she had found herself talking to him in it when she stood there alone in November, which she hoped he did not find strange. She told him Walt had built chairs for the dock. Good chairs, he'd said. Built right, they'll last 30 years. She sat with that for a moment. Then she told him, I think he means to be there when they're worn out. I think that's what he meant. And I told him we'd better be here to use them. The afternoon was quiet around her. A bird somewhere in the hedge that bordered the cemetery called, and waited and called. The grass was that particular green of May, the green that came back every year and always looked surprised at itself. She thought about Ruben buying the shack for $4,000 from Clyde Harwick in 1987. He had called her from the real estate office, excited in the contained way he had when he knew she was going to tell him it was impractical. Lola, he had said, I know it needs work, but you should see the lake. She had seen the lake. She had tolerated the shack as the price of loving him. She had read novels on the dock while he fished and called it a good weekend. She thought, I see it now, Ruben. I see why you loved it. The stone said nothing. Stones never did. But she had learned to hear him anyway in the silences that came after she spoke, in the particular quality of the air after his name left her mouth. She sat there until the light shifted and her knees reminded her that she was 75 and the grass was damp and she should stand up. Then she stood up. She put her hand flat against the top of the stone the way she always did when she left. The lake is good, she said. Come see it sometime. She drove back north through the valley with the windows down. Walt was there already. He had a habit of arriving at the dock in the late afternoon that had developed over the winter without discussion, the way things between them developed without announcement, without ceremony, in the quiet accumulation of ordinary days. He had his coffee. She had hers. They sat in the 2 chairs he had built over the winter. Good chairs, properly joined, built to last. The lake was absolutely still. Benicio called, she said. I know. He called me too. Walt looked out at the water. His granddaughter is a good kid. I've known her since she was small. They sat in the quiet. Not an empty quiet, but the full kind. The kind that 2 people make together when they have run out of the need to fill silence and have found that silence together is its own kind of warmth. Dolores looked at the lake and thought about everything it had held. Harlan Cutter's faith. Ruben's 30 years of morning casts. For years of her grief, quiet on the surface. The platinum in the dark below, patient as the stone it ran through. All of it held without complaint, given back when the time was right. Walt, she said. Thank you for the chairs. He glanced at her. He knew she didn't mean only the chairs. He had always understood what she meant, which was one of the things about him she had come to depend on without intending to depend on anything. Good wood, he said. Built right, they'll last 30 years. She looked at him. Then I suppose, she said, we'd better be here to use them. He looked back at her. His face was the face of a man who had been patient for a very long time and had just been told the patience had been worth it. He didn't say anything. He nodded once. They looked at the lake. The heron came in from the south on its long, slow wings and settled in the shallows without disturbing anything. The light was going gold over the ridge. Somewhere half a mile through the pines, the machinery was still. The day's work done, the earth giving up, slowly and carefully, what it had held for 100 years. Below the dock, below the cold, clear water, below the granite and the ancient rock, the seams ran on. Unchanged, patient, exactly themselves, as they had always been. As they would be long after all of this, the machinery and the lawyers and the scholarships and the sewing room and the 2 people in the chairs on the dock had done its work and gone quiet. The lake would still be the lake. That was enough. That had always been enough. Dolores held her coffee cup and listened to the water. And she thought. Harlan Cutter hid something under a floor because he trusted that the right person would find it. He trusted the lake. He trusted time. He trusted that decency was worth preserving even when everything around it was collapsing. He was right. He was right because a woman named Dolores Vega was evicted from her home at 74 with nothing left but a fishing shack on a cold mountain lake. And instead of selling it for $22,000 to a man who knew what it was worth and hoped she didn't, she got down on her hands and knees and scrubbed the floor. That was all. That was the whole story. A woman scrubbed a floor, and the lake gave back everything it had been holding. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.